Weidenfeld and Nicholson present Under Occupation by Alan First, read by Peter Noble. In 1942, in Nazi-occupied France, the German occupation authority rounded up émigré Poles, electricians, welders, machinists, and forced them to work as slave labourers at the naval yards in Kiel, where U-boats were built. The Poles fought back, stealing technical information and smuggling it to Paris, where it was sent on to the British Secret Intelligence Service in London. Midnight in Trieste. At dusk, the freighter tied up at the wharf, the amber street lamps of the town hazy and dim beyond the port. They stood together at the railing, amid a silence broken only by a distant foghorn and the wash of waves against the pier. She moved closer to him and said, "I never thought we would come back here." In response, he took her hand. Then a ship's officer unhooked the chain at the top of the gangway. It was time to go ashore. Paul Ricard, Midnight in Trieste. Occupied Paris, 1942. In early October, the first of the autumn storms began in the late afternoon, with rumbles of thunder up in Normandy somewhere. Then, by nightfall, the rain reached Paris, where it beat against the windows of the grey city and streamed down the channels at the edges of the cobblestone streets. The writer, Paul Ricard, walked bent over in the downpour, heading up a narrow street of ancient buildings in the 6th arrondissement, the Rive Gauche, the Latin Quarter. Ricard squinted into the darkness. Some of the street lamps had been shattered, others painted blue for the blackout ordered by the German occupation authority, and the coal smoke that drifted through the rain made it even harder to see anything. Turning a corner, he found himself on the Rue de l'Odéon, once home to Shakespeare and Company, Sylvia Beach's English-language bookshop. But the shop had closed a year earlier, and now Ricard, a writer of detective and spy fiction, had to get his newly published novels of intrigue at a recently opened store called The Bookshop on the nearby Rue de Conde. Ricard, rain dripping from the rim of his fedora hat, took a narrow alley to the street. He could reach out and touch the buildings on either side. He was heading for the bookshop to see a friend who had, voice excited, telephoned and asked that he come and see her at the shop. When Ricard entered the shop, his friend, an émigré Pole called Kasia, was manning the cashier's desk near the door. In her 20s, Kasia looked like a Parisian street kid. She had dark eyes and dark hair cut short, a boy's haircut, atop a firm, well-curved body. She wore a worker's tweed cap, a navy pea jacket, likely bought at a used clothing barrow, mole-coloured trousers, and ankle-high lace-up boots. Ricard nodded to her and waited while she served a customer, a German officer, tall and stern. "Delta of Venus," she said to the officer. "In fact, all the Anais Nin erotica is written for a private collector, so it's not available." "Oh, is that so?" The officer was clearly disappointed. "But we carry a book, a kind of diary that's similar. Would you care to have a look at it?" "Why, yes." The German visibly brightened. "I would love to see it." Kasia looked at Ricard as she left the desk and raised her eyes to heaven. Yet one more German trying to buy dirty books. She left the desk, walked over to the shelves, and returned with a slim volume. On the soft cover, an artful line drawing of a nude couple in a complicated embrace. "Here it is," she said. "The Diary of Lady X. It is erotica for every taste, and lavishly illustrated." "Thank you," said the German, in school French. "This will do very nicely." Ricard could think of nothing but the well-known quote from the rogue publisher Maurice Giraudiat, who described such books as books that one reads with one hand. The German paid Kasha and left the store with his new book wrapped in a sheet of newspaper. "That's the 10th copy we've sold this week," Kasha said to Ricard. "The Boche come to Paris with lists. The best restaurants, the fanciest brothels, and where to buy books that get them ready for the brothels, where they especially like exhibitions. They've conquered Europe, so they can do whatever they like, they think." Kasha shrugged. "They'll go away, Ricard, sent back to where they came from, and here in Paris we'll dance in the streets." "Is the book any good?" Ricard said. "It's arty. I prefer a good blue movie." "So, Kasha, you called?" "Yes, we have the book you wanted, Arthur Koestler, Scum of the Earth. It's 60 francs. Ricard thanked her and paid for the book. Ricard left the bookshop and headed for the nearby Café Saint-Germain. The day was dark and drizzling, and he needed a coffee. Heading down the street, he heard some kind of commotion behind him, and as he turned to see what was going on, a running man slammed into him. Both of them fell on the pavement. In the distance, shouts of "Halt!" and the trills of police whistles. As the man struggled to get to his feet, he mumbled an apology. He was dressed as a worker, baggy, shapeless grey trousers and a soiled shirt, but he had the face of an intellectual, a white goatee, and spectacles with a cracked lens. Now, from the direction of the shouts and whistles, a pistol shot, then 2 more. As the man stood up, the air snapped by Ricard's ear, and his hand flew to his face, but there was no blood. The bullet had missed him. Meanwhile, all around him, people dived flat on the pavement. Up the street, a woman screamed. The man now took off running and almost made the corner, but a shot knocked him down. Ricard ran to him as he got to his knees and took the man by the elbows to help him up. As he did, the man whispered, "Here, take this," and shoved a folded sheet of notebook paper into Ricard's shirt pocket. Then the man sagged to one side and fell the rest of the way to the ground. As Ricard again reached to help him, he saw the life leave the man's eyes. He stared, unknowing, at the sky. Ricard ran into the café as a Paris police car skidded to a stop. He sat down at an empty table where the waiter hadn't yet removed a coffee cup and pretended to be just another patron. All around him, the crowd spoke in undertones. Who was he? A résistant? 2 flics entered the café and, using their pads and pencils, began to look at papers and write down names. The flic needed glasses. "Richard," he said, squinting at Ricard's passport. No, Ricard. He immediately regretted the correction. He'd had a chance to keep his name unknown. But his reaction had been instinctive. "Do you know the man you helped?" The flic said. "No. Who was he?" The flic said nothing and moved on to a woman, hand still pressed to her heart at the next table. Ricard took the folded paper from his pocket, opened it, and saw what he believed was an engineering schematic, with the hand-printed German word Zunder and the French word détonateur. So, a detonator. Get rid of it, he thought. But a dying man had thrust this paper into Ricard's shirt pocket, and Ricard couldn't throw it away. In the street outside the café, an ambulance, sirens still running, pulled up next to the body. Then a Gestapo officer in a black uniform told the attendants to leave the man alone. A moment later, a Gestapo Mercedes pulled up, and 2 soldiers hauled the man's body into the back seat. Then the car drove away. Hurrying down the rain-swept Rue de Condé, Ricard wore a battered felt hat and a khaki-coloured trench coat. At 40, he had a moderately handsome face, but was no movie star. Still, women were greatly attracted to him. He was smart and funny and kind, with one particularly appealing feature. He had green eyes, a deep, rich green, knowing eyes, intelligent eyes. He had also a naturally seductive voice, quiet and assured, and just deep enough. At the age of 20, he had left the Sorbonne. He would not become a lawyer or a teacher. His father had died the same year, and his mother, rather too quickly, remarried. Alone, and without much money, he decided to do what he wanted, to be a journalist, and found his subjects wherever he could. For example, a recently acquired Velázquez painting, an Adoration of the Magi, was now on exhibition at the Louvre. At the Crêperie Jules, on the Rue de Rennes, some of the best crêpes in Paris, generously stuffed with scrambled eggs and ham. The beloved Hungarian film actress Beata Marcosi, last seen in Love for One Night, was in town to sign a contract for a new movie and was staying at the Hotel Bristol. And he haunted the courts. The Delaunay gang of bank robbers captured at last, the widow Robet, who poisoned her husband for his life insurance, the assassination of the Serbian consul in Bordeaux. Balkan politics? No, an affaire d'amour. Though when the spurned lover went to the guillotine, Ricard stayed home. That he did not need to see. Ricard sold many of his articles to small Parisian weeklies for a few francs, no more. But some of what he witnessed captured his imagination. Not so much the jealous lovers, not so much the scheming postal clerks, not the pistol-waving robbers or the embezzling bank presidents. It was the political crimes that drew his interest. When the poet Azerbaijan cried out, "Armenia will never die," as he fired his revolver at the foreign minister, Ricard wanted more. What was the story here? Who were these fiery rebels who gathered at a café in the 17th arrondissement? There was, he realized, a novel in this. Yes, a detective novel in form, but pitched higher, for the sophisticated reader who wanted more than a detective with a cold, waiting for a train. Thus, in 1934, a year of Stalinist purges, was born L'Affaire Odessa, the Odessa affair. The hero, a minor journalist, Roquette, hunted in the streets of Paris by Soviet secret agents. The cover was lurid, colourful portraits of Roquette, Sauvard of the Deuxième Bureau, the mysterious Ludmilla, the secret agent Mishkin. The book sold well. The publisher said, "When may we expect another?" Ricard had grown up on the Rue des Lombards, in a small apartment that his family could barely afford. It was his mother who had fretted about having a good address. His father had worked 6 days a week as a clerk in an insurance company, adding columns of figures on an adding machine with a tape. One pressed the numbers one wanted, then pulled a handle on the side of the machine, which produced various clicking noises until the numbers appeared on the tape. Thus, his father was absent during the day, and absent again at night, sitting in his easy chair, absorbed with his newspaper, smoking the daily bowl of tobacco he allowed himself, then holding the unlit pipe in his teeth. Ricard's mother was also absent, busy with what she called helping friends. How did she help them? By cleaning their apartments. She never would say, deflecting his questions until he no longer asked about her work. Alone in the afternoon after school, then as a grown man, Ricard walked. Sometimes his eyes discovered a face he wanted to study, sometimes a shop window displaying things which he would never own. But he hardly cared. What he wanted to do was walk. Perhaps it helped that he was walking in Paris, one of the great places in the world to walk. But Ricard as a boy and then as a man didn't think about that. The monuments, cathedrals, fountains, sculptures of generals on horseback. All this was simply background scenery to Ricard. So he walked and became a writer, because while walking his mind was everywhere, in Chicago, in Siam, in a boudoir as a lady undressed, at the circus, on a battleship, in the jungle with a native guide. "Sir, a lion!" In the snows of Russia, as one of Napoleon's Corsican troopers. On New York's Lower East Side with gangsters. "Louis, we gotta rub him out." At the North Pole with explorers and sled dogs, lost at sea on a sailing ship. Where didn't he go? Different now. As he walked, Ricard thought about his life, his friends, the women he knew, money. Too much about money. Think of something else. And the occupation. Though that thought, like the occupation itself, oppressed him. Still it was there. Strolling German officers with their French girlfriends, Vichy types with their lapel badges of the Francisque, the double-bladed battle axe. The sight of such lapel badges inflamed his heart. All his life, Ricard had been a peaceable sort. Conflict upset him, but now he would have to fight. He'd avoided, like most Frenchmen, the idea of resistance, avoided it for 2 years, waiting for rescue, waiting for the Americans, as people put it. But he couldn't wait any longer because it would in time damage his soul. No, he told himself. He couldn't just write something hostile about the Germans. He would need to do something. To act. Heading for a friend's apartment, Ricard took the Fille du Calvaire métro. The carriage was packed with Parisians, looking grim and weary after 2 years of occupation. Nobody spoke. The carriage was silent, and Ricard was glad to get off at the Pont d'Alma station, also glad that the fierce rain had abated to a sullen drizzle, and he could smoke as he walked. He headed quickly up the Avenue Bosquet, staring down at wet leaves plastered to the pavement, past apartment buildings in which it cost a fortune to live. Midway up the avenue, he crossed the street to avoid 2 flics, cops in their black rain-capes. All too conscious of the engineering schematic, he didn't want to be stopped and searched, because with the flics you never knew. Some were loyal to Vichy, some were loyal to France. Some were loyal to themselves, so best cross the street. Just before the avenue met the Rue de Grenelle, Ricard found the apartment building he was looking for. When he rang the bell by the street door, the concierge let him in, her greeting letting him know that she'd seen him often enough to remember him. He took the cage lift to the 4th floor and rang his friend's doorbell. Almost immediately, Romani appeared in a fitted charcoal-grey dress, heavily perfumed, perfume bought on the black market, no doubt, and even then, alcohol, a designated war material, hard to find. He said, "Romani," touched her cheek, and she stepped back so he could get a better look. She knew the beauty gods had been good to her that evening. Rumour was that she was Hungarian, had been born in Budapest, to, of course, a family of penniless aristocrats. Asked if this were so, she waved her hand in dismissal. Of Hungarians? Aristocrats? But Ricard had been with her at a cafe a few months earlier, and a well-dressed woman had stopped briefly at the table, addressed Romani as Madame la Baronne, and ceremoniously lowered her body. Ricard, astonished, said, "Was that a curtsy?" Romani said, "Pouf, another life," and changed the subject. Romani was in her 40s, maybe, with light brown hair that fell to her shoulders, and had some witch in her. All-knowing gaze, mysterious smile with laugh lines at the edge of her heavily made-up eyes. But when she took off her clothes, and she was good at this, she was a new woman. She had silky skin and was shaped like a statue of a Greek goddess, if the goddess had put on a few extra pounds. The first time Ricard had seen her thus, he was both surprised and inspired, and they had spent a particularly devilish afternoon in bed. Not for nothing did Romani keep a stack of erotic novels on her bedside table. As Ricard closed the door, Romani took his hand and said, "Let's go to the parlour. I'm delighted you telephoned. I needed a visitor today." In the foyer, she said, "Hang up your hat and coat, you are soaked." He followed her down a hallway that led to the parlour. It was a spacious apartment. Ricard sometimes wondered how she'd got hold of it. Apartments like this were expensive and difficult to find. She beckoned him to sit on the sofa, and saying, "What filthy weather," inclined her head towards the window, where droplets ran down the glass, while out on the Avenue Bosquet, Parisians under black umbrellas hurried through the wet evening. Romani left the room, returned with 2 glasses of red wine, gave him one, sat on the other end of the sofa, and said, "Filthy wine, to go with the filthy weather." "Occupation," he said. "All the good bottles went to Germany." "And may they choke on it." He raised his glass, joining her in the toast. "So how goes your life, Ricard?" "Well enough. Like everyone here, I improvise." "Writing?" "As always. I just delivered the next. What are you reading?" She shrugged. "The usual, dreadful stuff. In the 1890s, a young girl comes to Paris from the provinces, filthy men with beards and ankle-length drawers." "Only men in this one?" "Heavens, no. In one scene, the girl wears a little maid's costume." Romani crossed her arms over her breasts and said in the voice of a supposedly naive maid, "Oh, madame, we mustn't." Ricard laughed. "You do that well." She sat forward and said, "Ricard, my love, do you have a few extra francs? I'm collecting for Janine, the wife of the neighborhood pastry cook." Ricard handed over some francs. "What happened to the pastry cook?" "Shot." "Any reason?" Romani raised both shoulders and eyebrows in a brief shrug. "Who knows any more?" "Romani, I need your help." Ricard said, "You used to, maybe last spring, have a lover who was an army colonel." Romani's face softened. "Ah, Deroux. Yes. He was for years in the military intelligence. Now he's retired to the country. The Vichy generals didn't like him, didn't trust him, thought he was in touch with the English. So now he's gone to his country house, in the village of Les Andelys, on the Seine. You can write to him there. Colonel J.P. Deroux, Les Andelys, Eure, will do for an address. Care for another glass?" "Thank you, I would." "I'll have one too. It, warms me up, if you know what I mean." She returned with the wine. They touched glasses, drank, and talked for a time. Then she leaned over from her end of the sofa and rested a gentle hand on the side of his face. This gesture, of all that women did, had always reached him more than any other. "I'm cold, Ricard. Let's get under the covers." Ricard spent the night at Romani's. He didn't have a choice. It was 2 a.m, well past the 11 o'clock curfew, by the time they'd made all the love they could. But he didn't mind at all, and he slept better with a woman beside him. In the morning the two went to a café for coffee. Occupation coffee. A few inferior beans, with ground chicory added for volume. But at least it was hot. Ricard bought a sheet of paper and an envelope from a tabac across the street and wrote Colonel Deroux a brief letter. His old friend Romani had suggested they should meet, so would the colonel be so kind as to telephone him at this number on the 15th? The call was set 3 days in the future, but the French postal service was famously fast, even under the occupation. Ricard then determined that he'd better stop carrying around an incriminating document, so took the métro to the Saint-Michel station and walked up the tiny, too narrow for cars, Rue de la Huchette, to his apartment. 2 small rooms under the roof, a garret with windows that looked out on the Seine, the Ile de la Cité, and Notre-Dame Cathedral. In one room, a narrow bed, a table that held a well-used Remington typewriter with a French keyboard, a stack of paper, a telephone, and a small radio. By the door stood an impressive walnut armoire next to a small stove that ran on kerosene. His other room was sparsely furnished, an old, sagging sofa, a hideous standing lamp with a lords and ladies scene on the shade, and a cafe ashtray on the floor. The perfect place to read. The garret was very much a sanctuary, where, when storms rolled in from the North Sea, he could hear rain drumming on the slate tiles of the roof. Ricard took the schematic from the German newspaper and buried it in the middle of his stack of paper. On the 14th of October, just after 10 in the morning, Julien Montresor left his umbrella in the urn outside his office and started work for the day. His office, at Éditions Montresor, Montresor Publishing, was a small room on the second floor of 9 Rue Jacob, one of the better streets in the 6th arrondissement. A few feet away from him sat Madame Anne Legros, war widow, sweet face, heart of gold, his single employee, editor and secretary, who just then gave a gentle sigh of despair and lowered her blue pencil towards a page of manuscript. As for Montresor, this was a triumphant morning. Awaiting his attention was the new Paul Ricard novel, a pile of tattered, typewritten pages, its coffee and wine stains, its cigarette burns, testaments to a long journey from desk to café and back again. A detective novel, Minuit à Trieste, Midnight in Trieste, from a master of the form, the writer he thought of as the French Eric Ambler, an entertainment, but a smart one, written with a sharp eye and a big heart. The novel was set on a rusty old steamship, the Rosemarie, that sailed back and forth between Venice and Trieste in the year 1938. It had been an elegant ship in the 1920s, but the oak panelling in the staterooms was grey with age, the floral carpeting faded, the portholes cloudy, and the smell of the kitchen strong in the passageways as the ship crossed and recrossed the Adriatic, pitching and rolling in the spring storms. The cast of characters was the usual in such novels: secret police informants, spies, ruined aristocrats, sinister Balkan types, and lithe exotic women with shadowy pasts. Travelling with them, the hero, the foreign correspondent, Claude Verbin, a committed anti-fascist who smoked little cigars and wore tinted spectacles. So then, who stole the briefcase from the Countess in Stateroom 6? Montresor was eager to publish this novel. The French, cities blacked out, apartments frigid, rationed food hard to come by, soap a rare treasure, were intent on reading their way through the occupation. The detective novel by far the genre of choice because it took the reader away from the grim reality of daily life. These books were not so easy to find. The first printing sold out immediately, then second-hand, third-hand, and beyond. They were bought at the bouquiniste stalls on the banks of the Seine as soon as they were put out for sale, and in time, read to pieces. On the night of the 14th of October, Ricard attended a salon given by his publisher in the wealthy suburb of Neuilly. The house, built of grey cut-stone block, virtually exhaled quiet money, and the room where the reception was held even more so. Floors of blonde oak parquet, set in dark walnut bands, peach-coloured silk draperies, 18th-century paintings. Ricard wandered a little, took a glass of champagne and looked for somebody he knew. That turned out to be the host himself, Julien Montresor. "Ah, Ricard, so glad you're here." The voice deep, the words musically fashioned, the smile welcoming. Montresor wore a certain kind of beard, salt and pepper aging towards grey, which crossed his upper lip, past his mouth, and ended in a square-cut shape below his chin. There was, to Ricard, something Mephistophelian about this beard, as though Montresor had just ascended to the stage in an opera, the effect heightened by glistening eyes, dark enough to catch the light. Montresor took his elbow and said, "Lots of writers here tonight, Ricard. Sadly not all mine. But let me introduce you around." Montresor led him past small groups of men and women in earnest conversation, until he found a slim wand of a man with a close-cut beard. "This is Jacques Dichaine. You'll know his book, Un homme de la cité, a man of the city." They shook hands, and as Montresor moved away, Dichaine said, "Look at all this. Where does the money come from? Surely not Éditions Montresor?" "You never know. In France, a lot of people have money for all sorts of reasons." Ricard said, "You are right. There are more than a few whose families got rich in the slave trade." "Well, it's not like you can't be rich from books. Gaston Gallimard does very well from Proust, and Sartre. Simenon, for God's sake, he must write a book a week and they sell like crazy." "Always the same book," Dichaine whined. "That boring Maigret." "But people buy them. It's an addiction." "Well, I'll never be famous," Dichaine said. "My books are too serious, too intellectual, so I have to spend my life teaching in a lycée." Before his tale of woe could pick up steam, Montresor appeared with a tray of champagne glasses. As Ricard and Dichaine exchanged empty glasses for full ones, Montresor said to Dichaine, "Have you met the journalist Bonheur? He writes about books for the Le Matin newspaper, and he's here tonight." As Dichaine was led away, Ricard met Montresor's eyes, grateful for the rescue. Ricard then wandered through the crowd, which was getting louder as the wine flowed. Next, Ricard found himself facing a young man with dark curly hair and a dark curly smile. "I know you," the man said. "You are Paul Ricard. I recognized you from your photograph on the dust jacket. I've read all your books, some of them twice." "I'm glad you like them." "I love them! Tell me something. What happened to Annabelle?" "Who the fuck is Annabelle?" Ricard said, You know Annabelle in Rue Obscure, Shadow Street. At the end she's going off to meet Michel. Does she meet him or not?" "I guess she does. He's her lover after all." "Her lover? I thought he was her rich uncle. Is she also his lover?" "Oh, yes, of course. I suppose she meets him, but the book ends there, so the reader—" The man leaned closer and spoke in a confidential voice. "Ricard, what's it like, being a spy?" "I'm not a spy." The man laughed an "oh sure" laugh. "How else would you know all that stuff? About the Deuxième Bureau and secret ink?" "I make it up. I'm a novelist. That's what we do." The young man was about to get angry when a single note, ting, drew their attention to the fireplace, where Montresor stood holding a knife and a glass. He tapped the glass a second time and the room grew quiet. "We are privileged to have music tonight. Here is Monsieur Louis Machet, the well-known nightclub violinist, and his accompanists on guitar and bass." To polite applause from the guests, the three musicians began to play. Machet was a pink-faced gentleman with flowing white hair and wore a printed silk scarf knotted cleverly about his neck. It was easy to imagine him among the tables of a nightclub, serenading the couples seated close together. The trio began to play a version, sentimental and syrupy, of Begin the Beguine, as the guests paired off and started to dance. Ricard discovered that Madame Anne Legros, the sweet-faced war widow who worked for Éditions Montresor, was at his side. "Would you care to dance?" he said. Yes, thank you. I would, Madame Legros said. It was a tired old phrase, trite and corny. Yet it happened. She melted into his arms. As they danced together, he held her close, felt the warmth of her body, took a step left, then another, and she followed him easily, holding his hand in a way that was both intimate and tender. I know this song, he said by her ear. It's Begin the Beguine. Perhaps we should dance the Beguine. Do you know how? She asked. No idea. Well, we'll do the best we can. Montrésor appeared from the milling crowd. Ricard, he said. Louis Ferdinand Céline just showed up. I need somebody to talk to him. He's a fascist, Montrésor. A Nazi. I want nothing to do with him. Montrésor sighed and said, You're sure? A German Nazi's bad enough, but a French Nazi. Montrésor went off in search of a different guest. Madame Legros said, Bravo, Ricard. And then the two started dancing again. Kasia lived in a room above the La Villette stockyards, in the 19th arrondissement. Day and night the livestock trucks rattled in from the countryside, and cattle cars arrived by rail, the beasts driven down ramps into the pens. At 11 in the morning of the 17th, wearing only bra and panties, she sat on the edge of the bed, a cigarette held between her lips, and, squinting through the smoke, worked at loading the clip of her .25 caliber Browning automatic. When she was done, she snapped the clip back in place, then yawned and stretched out on the bed, smoking her cigarette and gazing up at the clouds that drifted past her window. She rested an idle hand between her legs and thought about past lovers, brief, exciting scenes that stayed with her. She could think of whomever she wanted, whoever stimulated her, some she'd never spoken to. Too bad they didn't know. It might have pleased them. In time, she found herself thinking about a girl she'd seen that morning on the métro. Young, perhaps a secretary, with a soft face and a shag of blonde hair across her forehead. A little bunny rabbit, she thought, in need of a stern hand. What would it be like with her? In her imagination, she took off the girl's blouse, her skirt, and her bra and panties. Then she touched the girl in a certain spot, between the shoulder and the neck. The girl liked that and let her know it. Maybe tomorrow morning, Kasia thought, she would take the same métro. But first she had to rob a bank. Her eyes wandered to the Browning she'd left on the windowsill. Pity. Now I want to make love, but it's not going to be. I'll likely get killed today. Ah, Kasia. The joke's on you. Here's some bank guard, an old man with his hat down on his ears, and he just made a hole in you. Too sad because you already have all of those you need. This one more is trouble. And why, you silly bitch, are you lying on the marble floor? It's cold down here and hard, and Jacques is running away. Jacques was her partner in crime. A small-time gangster, curly black hair, a knife scar through one eyebrow, a belted black leather overcoat, big gold watch, gold bracelet. A gangster. Miserable, mean bastard, she thought, running away when she was wounded. Jacques wanted her. He'd teach her to like men. Old story. Proud Parisian male, sure of himself. She wouldn't have cared if she never saw him again, but he was a good bank robber. And he was in the milieu, the life of crime, and he knew people who stole cars, then rented them out to gangsters like Jacques, people who bought stolen jewelry, people who had hideouts in the city, So she put up with him, let on that his seductive lines amused her. Suddenly, fast, heavy steps on the stairway. Jacques. He was coming to collect her. So the bunny rabbit would just have to wait. Work to be done, tra-la, banks to be robbed, tra-la, Kasha to be shot, tra-la. Colonel Deroux telephoned Ricard on the afternoon of the 15th from a cabinet at the Bureau de Poste in the village of Les Andelys, raising his voice because it was a long way to Paris. If Ricard would care to come to visit him on the 16th, there was a local train, the 2:36 from the Gare de Lyon. The colonel would send somebody to meet him at the station. This turned out to be a paysan wearing a tattered straw hat sitting on a farm wagon pulled by a skinny nag. Ricard climbed up next to him, and, not far from the station, the paysan turned onto a route départementale, the name for the rough, narrow roads, almost a car and a half in width, and paved with ancient tarmac. The road was lined with plane trees, trunks grey and knotted, crowns pollarded into round shapes, where the dying leaves rattled in the autumn breeze. On either side of the road the wheat had been harvested, leaving fields of brown stalks lit by the pale blue sky that followed a rainstorm. As the wagon passed a stone roadside marker, 30 miles to Rouen, a flock of geese flew overhead, migrating south in a V formation, their honking loud above the quiet fields. It was famously beautiful here, in what was known as the Vexin, the Seine Valley, the valleys and hills in a perfect harmony of land. From time to time the road ran next to the river, flowing north, its surface churned by strong currents from yesterday's rain. A gust of wind sent dead leaves rustling across the road, and Ricard felt, as the horse clopped along and one of the wheels squeaked, that he was home. Paris and its mobs of people left behind. The village of Saint-Denis quickly passed. He was now in France. As the paysan turned onto a dirt lane, also lined with plane trees, the horse quickened her pace. She knew she was home, and around a gentle curve, a house appeared, at least 100 years old. Colonel Deroux's house, the curved terracotta roof tiles now crooked, the shutters green paint flaking away. When the paysan pulled up to the door, some French version of a border collie stood guard, barking at them and prancing about until the colonel appeared and reassured her. The colonel was lean and fit, and stood erect, was clean-shaven and had grey hair cut in the military fashion. A retired warrior, Ricard thought, waiting for a call to duty that would never come. After they'd shaken hands, Colonel Deroux said, "Welcome, Monsieur Ricard," and showed him into the house. Inside, the ceilings were low, the furniture well worn, the floors covered with threadbare oriental carpets, oil portraits of ancestors, many in uniforms long abandoned, hung on the walls. When the colonel had settled in an overstuffed chair, a servant entered the room with a tray of tiny glasses and a bottle of cognac. "Vive la France," the colonel said, raising his glass, and Ricard echoed him. "My friend, Romani," the colonel said. "She is well?" "Oh, yes. She sends her fondest regards." The colonel smiled. Some nostalgia in his expression, memory of an old and treasured love affair. There followed the necessary prelude, the weather, the house and its peculiarities. Then the colonel said, "So then, monsieur, what brings you to my house?" "I had a strange experience the other day. A man fleeing the police gave me a drawing before he was shot and killed." Ricard drew the engineering schematic from the inside pocket of his jacket. The colonel found a pair of spectacles on a table next to his chair, put them on, and peered at the drawing. "A detonator, maybe for a German torpedo. Where did it come from?" I would guess it was copied at an armaments facility, perhaps in northern Germany, where the workforce is composed of Polish slave labourers. Then it journeyed, I have no idea how, to Paris. I can't do anything with this document, Monsieur Ricard, but I think you should. The English will be glad to have it. In war, the smallest thing may be important, crucial, you never know. But getting it to them will not be easy. Still, I can send you in the right direction, to someone in Paris. But I'm sure you understand how very dangerous it is for you to be in contact with such people. So, will you take the chance?" After a moment, Ricard said, "Yes." The colonel nodded, then stood. "Let's go for a walk, shall we?" They left the house and walked across a field of wheat stalks. The colonel's dog ran ahead of them, pawing at the brush, sometimes looking back with hypnotic blue eyes. "Nadine is hunting rabbits. She's good at it. Perhaps we'll have lapin for dinner," the colonel said. "Tell me, monsieur, did you serve in the military?" I was too young for the Great War, but in 1940 I was called up in May, sent to an infantry unit fighting near Soissons on the River Aisne. We had old Lebel rifles, the model 1886 for the year of manufacture. So, we did the best we could. "Le débâcle, we call it now," the colonel said. "Everything went wrong, nobody really responsible. Which is the worst merde, of course. The politicians fought each other all during the 30s. Fighter planes weren't built. Tanks were manufactured without radios. The tanks at least had treads, but the fuel trucks didn't. Now Paris is full of German tourists." "We held our own," Ricard continued. "Fighting on the river, old rifles and all, we never ran away. But then the Panzer tanks appeared, the Blitzkrieg went right through us. My unit surrendered. They had us marching up some road, but at nightfall I took a walk." "Ah, yes, the famous Blitzkrieg, lightning war, unstoppable. A Goebbels invention, that idea. The Germans had to win quickly because they didn't have fuel for their tanks. Wehrmacht truck drivers were allowed only 10 days' practice. These boys came from the country. Most had never driven anything. So now they're trying to drive trucks on Russian roads." "What will happen there, do you think?" A rabbit came scooting out of the brush, Nadine in close pursuit. But the rabbit found a hole and disappeared. The dog stood there, staring at the hole, then turned to look inquisitively at her master. "Where did it go?" "The Russians will destroy the Wehrmacht. Too many Russians. Many are killed, but more appear. It's the same with tanks and warplanes. Hitler is deluded. The Germans don't know it yet, but they'll find out." When Ricard and the colonel reached a hedgerow that bordered the colonel's property, they turned around and walked back to the house. After another cognac, the colonel said, "Why don't you stay for dinner? We'll eat early and you'll just make the 907 back to Paris." "Thank you," Ricard said. "It will be good to have company. Now, it's come time for me to help you with your diagram. But please, everything I tell you is in confidence." "Naturally. One thing the occupation has taught me is to keep my mouth shut." The colonel nodded with approval. "There is a café, the Café Albert, on the Rue Saint-Dominique, in the 7th arrondissement. At 4 in the afternoon, approach the barman. It is the proprietor, Albert, who works that shift. And tell him you are seeking one Monsieur Duval. Then sit down and wait. This may take some time. Eventually, you will be given a contact, likely an address where you will be put in touch with the people who will know what to do with your diagram. I would strongly suggest that when you enter the café, you take a good look around. The Gestapo is known to be active in that quartier, drawn by the wealth and status of the arrondissement's population." "I will be careful, Colonel." "Now, dinner, can you smell it?" "I can." Beef stew with potatoes and carrots, a specialty of my cook, especially since the occupation. At least you won't have to use your ration coupons. We don't eat so badly out in the countryside, especially when an old cow dies. 17th of October. His instructions from the colonel would have him at the Café Albert at 4 in the afternoon. So Ricard decided to make himself work for 2 hours, then leave for his rendezvous at 3:30. He glanced at his watch, a few minutes after 11. Get busy, he told himself, because this book won't write itself. Ricard had a writer's fantasy based on The Sorcerer's Apprentice, where an enchanted broom sweeps the floor by itself. Perhaps if he spoke the words of a magic spell, his typewriter would write his new novel while he watched. He stared at the Remington, but it just sat there. With an unvoiced sigh, he squared up his stack of blank paper, adjusted the position of his typewriter, and aligned 2 sharp pencils. Now, where was he? He always started his novels by writing an outline, which was supposed to spell out the entire book, but his effort never lasted longer than 50 pages. Still, he had to try. Working title, The Investigator. On his bookshelf there was the autobiography of a Parisian arson investigator written in the 1930s. Many stories and much technical description. So then his new hero would be an arson investigator. Ricard named him Valois. Valois is a confidential agent, a private detective whose speciality is arson and who works for insurance companies. In Paris. No, in Switzerland. In Zurich. That said, insurance company to Ricard. A suspicious fire has burned down a factory. Where? In France? No, a more foreign sort of place. Maybe Bucharest. Good. Valois would be sent by his hard-headed despot of a boss, who always at first scoffs at Valois' theories, to Bucharest. So he will go to Romania on... what else? The Orient Express. Now he would need a romance. Ricard lit a cigarette, sat back in his chair, and gazed out of the window for inspiration. Maybe, he thought, the larcenous rascal who burned down his factory would have a wife, a much younger wife. No, Valois was an honourable fellow. He wouldn't sneak around. He wouldn't chase wives. A lover? No, the same but worse. Give the factory owner a daughter, then, who lived at home and took care of the household. Not, on the surface, a beauty. She would be educated. She would be... He hunted for the word. Prim. He liked that word. Prim. So, put her hair up in a bun. Put her in spectacles. Give her compressed, disapproving lips. The shape of her body unknowable in the severe suits she wears. So, how would he seduce her? Much better, he wouldn't. She would seduce him, afraid that he knows the truth, and Papa will be arrested. At least that is what she tells herself. In fact, she has wanted Valois from the moment she first saw him. Trap. What to do with Papa? Let him go. Not in Ricard's detective novels or anyone else's. So then, kill him. Ricard had killed off inconvenient characters for his whole career, but it had to be their own damn fault. Their insatiable greed would prove their undoing. So, au revoir. Satisfied for the moment with his outline, Ricard found himself musing over his night with Romani. Was tempted to lie down on his bed for a while. However, he had to work, so sat forward and returned to his outline. 4 in the afternoon. Ricard entered the Café Albert on the Rue Saint-Dominique and found it busy and loud. He looked at the patrons, as he'd been instructed to do by the colonel, but at first saw nobody who might have been a Gestapo officer in civilian clothes. Well, there was one, sitting at a table with an aperitif, who didn't belong. But the Gestapo always travelled in pairs, and this cold-faced gentleman was alone. Ricard waited at the bar until the barman, Albert the proprietor, according to the colonel, came to see what he wanted. He ordered a beer and wondered if Monsieur Duval had been in yet. He saw the recognition in Albert's expression. Then the proprietor said, "Your friend is waiting for you at a toy shop called Le Petit Soldat on the Rue de Récollet, just across from the Gare de l'Est railway station. The shop is closed, but the door will be left open for you." The toy shop was indeed closed, the interior dark and still, but intact. There were shelves of soldiers, dolls and dolls' houses, toy trains with stations and engine drivers, and more, all beautifully crafted in fine detail, made of tin and wood, while the soldiers were moulded in lead. There were yo-yos, paddle ball sets, wooden puzzles and stuffed animals. In a shadowed corner of the shop, Ricard saw a striking woman, 30-ish and dark, with a gently curved nose and eyes almost black. She comes, Ricard thought, from the eastern Mediterranean, from Turkey perhaps. Stylish and poised, she wore a slate-grey raincoat and tight, shiny black gloves with gold buttons at the wrist. She could have, then and there, posed for the cover of a fashion magazine. Saying, "Bonsoir, monsieur." She moved towards him and shook hands, the hand inside her glove warm and firm. "Bonsoir, madame." She smiled to put him at ease, and said, her voice low and husky, "Thank you for coming to meet me. Would you please tell me your name?" "Paul Ricard. And you are?" "I am called Leila." Leila, he thought. Perhaps a false name, perhaps not, but the sound of her name touched his heart. She took from her pocket a sheet of stationery and a fountain pen, wrote down his name, then said, "I am told you are seeking to make contact with us." "Yes, that's right. I was instructed to approach a fellow at a bar. He sent me here." "And can you tell me who instructed you, Monsieur Ricard?" "A French military officer." "And his name was?" "I'll just leave it at that." He smiled. She smiled. This was a spy game. Rules had to be obeyed. "Very well," she said. "And what is your work?" "I'm a writer of detective novels." Now, she smiled. This news interested her. "Titled, for example?" "Oh, L'Affaire Odessa, for one." "And where do you reside?" "On the Rue de la Hichette, number 9. "Well," she said, "now that you've made contact, how can we help you?" I was given a certain document. There's nothing I can do with it myself, but I believe it might be useful to certain people in London. "May I see it?" Ricard took the schematic drawing from his pocket and handed it to her. "How do you come to have this?" She emphasized the word "you." "A man fleeing from the police was shot down in front of me. As I tried to help him, he put this paper in my pocket. Then he died." "And how much shall we pay you for it?" Ricard felt slightly affronted. "I don't want anything." Leila was pleased, nodded to herself. This wasn't an X transaction. This was a Y transaction. "Then perhaps we'll be in touch with you. Perhaps you might help us." "I will. Whatever you need, just ask. You have my telephone number?" "Yes, I have it." "Then you'll call me." She met his eyes, then nodded slowly, saying, "Soon." "Does someone own this toy shop?" Ricard said. Owned by Jews at one time. They fled, if they were lucky, or they were taken away. Whoever thought that such a thing would happen? Ricard said. There were those who did. Leila said. Throughout the 30s. Some of us knew, but nobody would listen to us. Sad. Ricard said. It is, Leila said. I will see you again, Monsieur Ricard. Whenever you like, Ricard said. She left the store, walking quickly, turned up the street, and disappeared. In Paris, the last day of October was a treasure. A bright sun, white wisps of cirrus cloud strung across the sky. And all over the city people were in a good mood. The commonplace exchanges of Parisian life, excuse me, you are welcome, the elaborate remercier version of thank you, delivered with intimacy and warmth. At 9 the previous night, Ricard had listened to the French programme of the BBC, volume down because you would be shot if they caught you doing it. The US Marines were fighting on Guadalcanal, the British making headway towards El Alamein, the Germans again repulsed before Stalingrad. In his garret, Ricard looked out of the window at the busy life of the Rue de la Huchette. So much in Paris happened in the street. On the terrace of the Café La Régence, the tables were all occupied. A formally dressed older man was buying flowers, bargaining, but not too hard, for a dozen red gladioli. Kids in short trousers were playing football with a ball made of old rags, shouting at each other as they ran. In time, Ricard forced himself back to work. Do you like writing? He was asked quite often. A difficult question. He hated hard work. And writing was very hard work, at least for him. A shrug and, I can't really do anything else, usually sufficed. At that moment, he was toying with the character Valois, the arson investigator in his novel, The Investigator. He put a moustache on him, then took it off, then put it back. A shaggy moustache, he thought. Valois was his own man, good enough at his job to dress as he liked and say what he wanted. Tightly wired heroes weren't much in evidence in Ricard's detective fiction. And then the Bucharest problem. Ricard had never been there, so time for the Guide Bleu and photos on the continent. A lucky photograph of a tram showed it painted red and yellow. He then installed yellow wicker seats. If some finicky reader knew different, well, too bad. The telephone rang. People often disconnected their phones because the Gestapo could use them as microphones and hear everything you said. But Ricard disliked being cut off from the world, and so kept his plugged in. He put the receiver to his ear and heard a woman's voice fraught with anxiety. Oh, Paul, it's your friend Leila. There's something I need to discuss with you. I'm in the station buffet at the Gare du Nord waiting for a train, but the train's late, so we'll have time to talk. I'll be right there. 2nd of November, 1942. At 10:30 in the morning, Kasia changed into a moss-green sweater and trousers beneath a raincoat. She tried putting the Browning automatic in her pocket, but it made the coat sag, so she put it in the waistband of her trousers. Then she rode her bicycle to a branch of the Banque du Commerce on the Avenue Hoche, a block from the Courcelles Métro. She began locking her bicycle to a lamp-post a little way from the bank, taking her time and looking busy while she waited for Jacques and his friend, Antec. 10 minutes later, walking fast, they arrived. Kasia entered the building first. Her job was to reconnoitre the bank and make sure nothing was different from a previous visit. The bank guard was the same one as before, a stoop-shouldered little man with grey hair, a holstered pistol at his waist, likely not cleaned for years, she thought. Shifting his weight, as, hands behind his back, he stood to one side of the vault. Kasia approached the high counter, got change for a 50-franc note, then left. Her reappearance was the signal for action, and she followed Jacot and Antec into the bank. Trouble right away. As Jacot shouted, "Hands up! Nobody move!" the bank guard drew his pistol and fired at Jacot, missed him but hit Antec in the foot. Antec cried out and began to hop back towards the entrance. Then the guard aimed at Kasia, but hesitated, possibly reluctant to shoot a woman. Such chivalry cost him dearly. As Kasia shot him twice in the thigh, Jacot grabbed the back of her overcoat and yelled, "Get out!" Turning to leave, Kasia found herself facing one of the tellers, terrified, scream stifled by a hand over her mouth. It was Paulette, last name forgotten, a former schoolmate at Kasia's lycée. Now Kasia was truly in the merde, and she swore as she ran for her bicycle. Up the street, Jacot was helping Antec into a taxi. She doubted the driver would forget them, and Paulette certainly wouldn't forget her. The waiting room at the Gare du Nord was crowded when Ricard arrived. The station buffet in one corner busy with people waiting to be served. Lost souls, with nowhere to go, nursed their coffees and read old newspapers they'd found left on the benches. Fugitive couples, trying not to be noticed, leaned towards each other in whispered conspiracy. Some of the people in the waiting room heading to the countryside in search of food held rolled-up burlap sacks and ancient valises, to be filled with potatoes, turnips, and carrots. Among the other travellers on the wooden benches, families leaving occupied Paris for occupied Lyon, hoping that life would be better there. Wehrmacht officers smoked and relaxed, knowing that the first-class carriages were reserved for them. Well-dressed businessmen checked their watches, fearing that their trains would be late. They feared also a train so overcrowded that the station master would order it to leave early. Despite the crowd, Leila, in her slate-grey raincoat and black leather gloves, was easy to spot. Ricard got a coffee and sat down next to her on the bench. "Very public place you chose for a meeting," he said. "They told me I had to see you right away. It seems that your drawing has caused a great stir." "Well, I'm glad to be rid of it. I think maybe they're not done with you. They asked me to give you this." This turned out to be a cinema ticket, a balcony seat for the following evening's showing of Les Visiteurs du Soir, The Night Visitors, a 15th-century costume drama directed by Marcel Carnet and starring Arletty, with Jules Berry as the devil. "Have you seen it?" Leila said. "I wasn't sure I'd like it." "Well, now you'll find out."
End of Disc 1. Disc 2.
Wehrmacht Major Erhard Geisler, properly SS Geisler, woke at 7:30, reached out to stroke his mistress. Sometimes she could be coaxed into lovemaking before breakfast, but found only a note on the dent in her pillow. "Sweetheart, I have early work this morning. See you tonight." The message was signed Kiki, her signature followed by abundant X's and O's. Kiki was originally from Alsace, and before moving to Paris worked as a stenographer at one of the numberless bureaux that administered the occupation of France. Geisler's suite at the luxurious Hôtel Crillon, the Germans had taken all the best hotels in Paris as their barracks, had 2 large armoires, and Gerhardt opened one of them and stared at the neat row of suits. What to wear today? He had a choice: civilian dress or uniform. In civilian dress he very much blended into the crowd, a pear-shaped fellow in his 40s, bland and colourless, with clear plastic-framed spectacles. Had he been in the Gestapo, he would have had to wear the uniform. But he worked for the SD, the Sicherheitsdienst, the intelligence service of the Nazi Party, and so could wear whatever pleased him. Well, not really. This morning he had a meeting. Representatives of all the German security services would have yet another discussion about the suppression of the French resistance, and everyone would be in uniform. So would he. But he didn't mind so much. His black SS uniform fitted perfectly, well sewn by one of the Jewish tailors in German concentration camps, where all German uniforms were made. From a row of shoes at the bottom of the armoire, he chose the well-shined black pair that accompanied his uniform. Geisler had a refined taste in shoes, having once worked as a salesman at a shoe store in Düsseldorf. That was in the bad old days before he joined the Nazi Party. He had a low, thus early registration number, had joined up with Hitler in the 1920s, and this fact helped him in the eternal power struggles that went on in high party circles. Now life went better. He made lists, using the endless stream of reports and denunciations that reached him from all over France, but particularly in Paris, where the citizens especially loathed the Germans and the occupation. From these lists he made other lists, and these unlucky people were arrested, interrogated, and sent on to concentration camps, or executed immediately. But Geisler never did any of this himself. He was what was known as a Schreibtischmörder, a desk murderer, a pale, insignificant man, but deadly. His job now, in occupied Paris, followed a certain doctrine, an old and honoured tactic of those who occupied nations other than their own. Control the culture. The Wehrmacht occupied France. Now the French had to be taught to think in a new way. So to control the culture, he needed the people who worked in that culture: journalists, radio broadcasters, teachers and writers. He had asked his secretary, a bright-eyed young lieutenant, to prepare a list. And on that list was the entry, Ricard, Paul J., detective novelist. The following evening, Ricard attended a showing of The Night Visitors, using the ticket for a seat in the balcony that Leila had given him. Before the occupation, Ricard had liked sitting in the balcony, where it was dark and intimate. But no more. Now the house lights were left on, by order of the Germans. Early in the occupation, the audience had been demonstrative once the cinema went dark, and the newsreel produced by the German propaganda department came on the screen. Demonstrative was barely the word. From the audience on those evenings, Hitler's appearance in the newsreel was greeted with a great barrage of oral farts, some loud and extended, others brief and sibilant. You couldn't find a public toilet in France with more variety. Meanwhile, on the screen, from a confident, smiling Hitler, a quote from yesterday's speech, "We are winning the war," said the subtitle, and a particularly loud chorus of flatulence had greeted that news. So the Germans decreed that the house lights must stay on. A very unwelcome decree to those who liked to kiss and hug at the movies. To the French, the Germans were harsh and relentless, but they were also very annoying. As Ricard climbed to the well-lit balcony, he thought, cinemas should not be seen in the light. The red cushions of the seats were stained and soiled, the carpeting on the floor no better, in some places ripped and sewn back together, and bore beneath the seats torn shreds of paper and old ticket stubs that the cleaners had ignored. An usher read his ticket stub, pointed out a vacant seat, and a few minutes later the newsreel began. German tanks crossing a bridge, girls in peasant costumes dancing in Wiesbaden. Then, leading another patron behind him, the usher beckoned Ricard to follow, climbed the stairs to the projection booth, and knocked on the door, which opened to admit Ricard and the other patron, who handed the projectionist a few banknotes folded together and nodded towards the door. Now the two of them were alone in the darkened booth, the unattended projector clattering away on its table. The other patron said, "You are Monsieur Paul Ricard?" "Yes, and you are? A friend of your friends in London. I am known as Theodore." He spoke almost, but not quite, as a native Parisian, in an educated voice with perhaps a faint note of Eastern Europe in his accent. He wore a powder blue double-breasted suit, a half-size too large for him, and was clean-shaven, had strings of colourless hair plastered across his scalp, sunken cheeks and crooked teeth. He seemed, to Ricard, obsequious, like a head waiter seeking a generous tip. "Monsieur Ricard," he said, "you are a writer. Is that correct? I believe I may have read a book of yours, A Season for War. Did you write that?" "I did." "It was very good, I thought. The intrigue especially. Do you have some practical experience in that area, working as a spy?" "None at all." "Well, here's your chance to get some. The people, civil servants we'll call them, in London who received the engineering schematic need your help. Urgently need it. They want more information. Who is doing this? Who got this to Paris? What are their names? How can they be contacted? Is it a resistance cell? To the people in London, that would be a real treasure. You see, Ricard, you've struck a nerve. The detonator in your diagram is to be used in a torpedo, and the torpedo, once installed in a German U-boat, is meant to destroy merchant shipping. Many lives lost, important cargo burned up or sunk, so you can't blame the British for pursuing the source of this. Wherever that drawing came from, there's more to be discovered. Maybe technology the British don't know about. Maybe people, Poles or others, who can help the British war effort. Do you see what I mean?" "Yes," Ricard said. "I would be lying if I said it wasn't dangerous. Here you enter Gestapo country. I know you are a French writer. Now you have a chance to be a French patriot." Ricard nodded and waited for more. "You must begin with your friend Kasia. Are you her lover? How did you meet her?" "I'm not her lover. She works with a gangster called Jacot, who is a bank robber." "Well, when it comes to fighting Nazis, nobody cares what Jacot does for a living. But first comes Kasia." "I met her in the bookshop where she works," Ricard said. "A small bookshop on the Rue de Conde, just off the Rue des Écoles, close to the Sorbonne, so there are always students around. On the shelves, Sartre, Camus, all the existentialists, and plenty of books by radicals, of the left, of course. Kasia and I somehow hit it off. We liked each other. She's a free spirit, you know, a tough Polish kid. Well, it sounds to me as though she would be willing to do more." The man who called himself Theodore paused, took a cigarette from his pocket, lit it and shook out the wooden match. "You'll have whatever help you need. Somewhere a long way west of this balcony you will find the bombed city of London, where, whistling as they climb over the rubble on their way to work, are certain British civil servants who have offices with obscure titles on their doors. They have, like the rest of their class, the most amiable and polite exteriors. But the work they do is secret, and often cruel. And the war, which at the moment Britain is losing, has made them desperate, so there is not much they won't do. Really, nothing they won't do. Now Hitler, in that lump of coal he calls a heart, believes he is fighting a nation of shopkeepers." From Theodore, a brief and very cold laugh. When he continued, he said simply, "He is wrong." On the screen, the wandering minstrel Gilles was seducing the innocent ingenue Anne, while the devil, who wanted Anne for himself, watched from behind a curtain. But then, in a close-up, the devil turned yellow, then brown, and started to disappear altogether. All this accompanied by the smell of burning acetate and whistles and offended shouts from the audience. Theodore quickly adjusted a lever on the side of the projector, and the movie began again. As the film continued, Ricard said, "Of course I could try to get what these people want, but it would involve going to Germany. And first I would have to obtain press credentials, a travel permit to cross the border, and I would need a reason to go." Theodore crushed out his cigarette on the floor of the projection booth and lit another. "What is your opinion of the Vichy government?" "They're traitors. Loathsome creatures. I have nothing but contempt for them. Any honourable Frenchman would say the same thing." Theodore nodded. Yes, he agreed. But the nod meant more. It acknowledged that what he had heard from Ricard was what he wanted to hear. "Dreadful people," he said. "Many are fascists, but most are opportunists who would do anything to rise above their competitors now that the game has changed. Of course, the Reich courts the Vichy sympathizers, treats them as friends, allies in the struggle for Europe. To get into Germany, you could pretend to be one of them." "Why me, Theodore? I'm just the detective novelist." "Not quite. You are now Kasha's handler, as the civil servants put it. So you are stuck with the job, and as a French patriot you'll do it well." Ricard hesitated, then agreed with, as the French put it, un petit oui. A little yes. "Good, Ricard. You'll have help. The civil servants have a lot of money and a lot of friends, so you are not without the resources. Go, and serve the honour of your country." 3rd of November. The morning after the robbery, Paulette, the teller at the Banque du Commerce who'd seen Kasha shoot the guard, was troubled from the moment she awoke. Turning to look at her husband, she saw that he was also awake. He was a mean, pompous man, a travelling salesman who sold dry goods in the Paris region. She said, "Pierre." Then the story came tumbling out in a rush. "Are you sure?"
"Yes, I'm sure. I knew her at Lycée."
"And so? What do you intend to do about it?"
"What could I do?"
"Inform the authorities, Madouce."
"You can't mean denounce her."
"You must. It is your civic duty to do so."
"I owe the Boche nothing."
"Well, it is more what they will owe us. 1,000 francs for this information, I would think."
"Please, I beg you, Pierre. Don't make me do such a thing."
"What if she's arrested and interrogated? What if they find out you recognized her? What then, eh? I'll tell you, then you'll be in the soup."
"You are telling me to go to the Boche?"
"Yes, we'll go together. To the occupation people at the Hôtel Majestic." Paulette resisted for a time, but eventually she agreed. Pierre was her husband, and one had to obey one's husband. Thus it happened that at dawn on the 5th of November, a squad of detectives, led by a German officer in civilian clothes, kicked in the door of Kasha's room. The flic knew where she lived, because the flic knew where everyone lived. Kasha sat bolt upright in bed as the lock gave way and the door flew open. She thought about reaching for her Browning, but it was wrapped in oiled paper and hidden at the bottom of a dead houseplant on her windowsill. The flic searched her room, but they never found it. They told her to get dressed, watched with interest as she did so, then pulled her hands behind her back and snapped handcuffs on her wrists. They took her to the massive Fresnes prison south of Paris, where she was locked in a cell with 3 other women. One of them was a young résistante who'd been caught leaving propaganda leaflets on the métro. One had fled with her lover, a chauffeur who'd stolen jewelry from his employer, and the last was a prostitute called Olga, who had slapped an official when he'd demanded something she didn't like to do. It was she who befriended Kasha who was in a bad way, facing years in prison for bank robbery. This was not the first time Kasia had been on the edge of catastrophe, and she had always managed to escape the final blow. But now she was never free from tears. Olga was a good soul. Sometimes at night would climb to the upper berth of the bunk and crawl in beside her, would hold and stroke her, and tell her everything would work out. On occasion the sympathy went beyond comfort, but this love-making was Kasia's preference, and she responded eagerly. Absolute silence was the rule at Fresnes for most of the day, but in the hours they were allowed to talk, Kasia told her cellmates some of her story. She had, in fact, been in jail before, 8 months in a Bulgarian prison in Sofia, and 5 months at Antalya in Turkey. But now she faced a trial in the indefinite future to be followed by time in prison. She had had no word from Jacques, who she thought was in hiding, having escaped with the wounded Antek from the bank robbery. Bad luck for Kasia that her old friend had been working at the bank. Bad luck that Paulette had denounced her. Fate, she thought. It would find you. But then, "Prisoner 45042, come to the bars." This from the wardress in her blue uniform. Kasia did as she was told. The wardress inserted a key in the barred cell door and let Kasia out into the passageway. "You have a visitor," she said, and led Kasia to the small room with a table and 2 chairs where visits took place. Kasia sat on the prisoner's side of the table and waited. Then a seedy man entered the room and sat across from her. He was not an appealing individual. He had sunken cheeks, strings of hair plastered across his head, and crooked teeth. "I brought you a tin of sardines and an orange," he said. "The guard has them." He had, Kasia thought, a slight Balkan inflection in his speech. "Thank you, monsieur." Theodore paused, then said, "Would you like to leave this place, Kasia?" "More than anything in the world. Who are you, monsieur? A lawyer?" The answer to this question was oblique, based on the probability that conversation in this room was being secretly recorded. "No, I am not a lawyer. My friends call me Theodore, and we have need of someone who speaks Polish. There is travel involved. Would you mind?" "It doesn't matter. Just tell me what to do." "That will come later. For the moment, expect a visit from a lawyer in a day or 2. You will be released, probably at night, and I'll be waiting for you outside the gates with a car." Kasia wanted to kiss his hand, an ancient peasant instinct that she resisted. "Thank you," she said. "Thank you, Theodore." Kasia had never felt such a surge of gratitude. At this point, Theodore left the visiting room. As she was led back to her cell, Kasia asked the wardress about the tin of sardines and the orange. But the woman just shrugged. That evening, Theodore met with Ricard, who had been directed at the Café Albert to a garage in the industrial suburb of Saint-Denis. It was a chilly, windless evening, with dry flakes of snow drifting down over the city, a thin slice of moon visible when the clouds parted. Ricard waited in the unlit garage, which reeked of petrol, and had the cold, dead air of a place that had never been heated. A third of the garage had been isolated by floor-to-ceiling wire mesh, with an ice-blue Bugatti sports car parked behind the wire. To Ricard, it looked like the car was in prison. After the Germans had occupied the country, they took all the cars, especially the fancy ones. Thus, wise owners had hidden their cars. The writer Simenon famously parking his in a barn. On the surface, Ricard was calm, a man doing what had to be done. He truly hated the loud, strutting Germans and wanted to strike a blow against them. But in his heart, what he really wanted to do was to run away. He'd been trapped. Trapped by what now seemed a foolish desire to help the war effort. Idiot, he thought. Naive idiot. Why had he not understood that in these times the idealist would pay a stiff price? With a caustic eye he looked back at Ricard the writer, who should have kept intrigue confined to paper. Now he was lost, moving down a labyrinth he didn't understand. But it was too late. This was no plot that could be revised. This was his reality, and he hated it. There was a door next to the shuttered entry to the garage, and a few minutes into Ricard's sermon to himself, the door opened and Théodore appeared. This was the clandestine Théodore, wearing an overcoat with the fur collar turned up and a hat tilted low to obscure his face. "Ricard," he said, "good that you are on time." Politely, Ricard said, "Bonsoir," as though they were two acquaintances who had just happened to meet in a deserted garage. "The civil servants in London," Théodore said, "have for years kept close watch on the French press, and they have a suggestion for you. Do you know the newspaper called Le Journal du Jour?" "Alas, I do. In the 30s, when the right and left were tearing each other apart, the Journal was worse than most. If a left-wing senator proposed money to improve the railroads, the Journal attacked. They called him a Stalinist. And blood, according to the Journal, dripped from his Bolshevik fangs. The foreign editor at the Journal is a Monsieur Lagache," Théodore said. "He will approve whatever you propose to do because he's been reached. As the Russians put it, he is nash, ours. Once you have an assignment in Germany, you must next get a travel permit from the Propagandastaffel at the Hôtel Majestic. Of course, you will be interviewed and you will reveal your Vichyite sympathies. In all probability, the man you'll see at the Propagandastaffel is called von Lobau. Major von Lobau is one of those Germans who, following the victory in 1940, pulled strings to get a job in Paris. He is enchanted with Paris. Was a tourist here before the war. You know the German expression, God lives in Paris. Well, von Lobau is a believer in Paris. The dingiest workers' cafes, the clochards with their bundles of rags, the smallest restaurant, mer this, chez that, where they serve every innard known to beasts, where you can smell piss on the pig's kidney you're served. Von Lobau loves it all." "It doesn't sound so bad," Ricard said. "Among tourists, it's a point of pride to have experienced the real Paris." "Well, Paris won't be the subject of your story for the Journal. That subject will be somewhere in northern Germany, close to the city of Kiel, where the Germans build their U-boats, using Polish laborers. Once you find your way there, you can begin to investigate. You can begin to make contact with the Poles who work there. And you will, if you are lucky and don't get caught by the authorities, find the source of your drawing, and work to get more." Ricard thought it over, then said, "There is one difficulty, Théodore. I don't speak Polish." "That eventuality has been foreseen," Théodore said, with some satisfaction. "Your friend Kasia will accompany you and act as your interpreter." At Théodore's direction, Ricard went to see Lagache, the foreign editor of Le Journal du Jour, at his office on the Rue de Richelieu. It was a small, cramped office on the shadowed side of the courtyard, with framed newspaper photographs on the walls, mostly well-dressed men shaking hands, radiant actresses with their escorts, and a few glum criminals being led away by detectives. Lagache had a dark complexion, with a thin nose, flanked by small eyes, set close together, and a mouth which had sneered so often that the twisted smile lived permanently on his face. He had a pencil line of a moustache, spectacles with thick frames, and wore the Vichy emblem, the Francisque, the double-headed axe on a lapel badge. Sitting across from him, Ricard felt palpable hatred flowing across the desk. According to Théodore, Lagache had been fixed, bribed. But that didn't stop him from loathing his enemies, one of his greatest pleasures. Like the rest of the world, Ricard was no stranger to being disliked. It happened. Still, Lagache's withering glare made him uncomfortable. As a fascist, Lagache was a fervent believer in the Vichy regime, thus a disciple of the white-moustached General Pétain, the leader of the French right wing who claimed that the fall of France was due to the corruption of the true French values, family, work, and religion. The followers of Pétain's enemy, General de Gaulle, were accused of drinking too much wine, eating too much fine food, and making too much love. Pétain would have called them libertines. Ricard called them French. After hating Ricard for a time, Lagache drew a gold fountain pen from his desk set, unscrewed the cap, affixed it to the end of the pen and said, "So then, Ricard, where is it you wish to go?" The absence of the Monsieur title was an insult, but Ricard didn't care. "I'm going to Lübeck, in Germany," Ricard said. He knew the city of Lübeck was 40 miles from the U-boat facilities in Kiel. "And what news event will you be covering?" The civil servants in London had an immense and very private library in an anonymous office building near the Mayfair district. Here they had every newspaper and journal published in the principal cities of the world, as well as books of a political nature, and it was one of their librarians who had suggested an assignment for Ricard. "A new bridge has been built across the river Trave," Ricard said. "It is to be called the Heinrich Himmler Brücke, and the opening ceremonies will take place on the 15th of November. Lagache wrote a few more words, then put the cap back on his gold fountain pen. Ricard could see that this was, to Lagache, a symbolic gesture. Power had spoken. Lagache then called to his secretary, seated just outside his office. Following the clackety-clack of her typewriter, Ricard had his assignment letter, on official Le Journal du Jour stationery, in an unsealed envelope. He rose to say goodbye, but drew from Lagache only a final and particularly intense glare. It wasn't simply emotion, Ricard thought. It was a threat. "When Germany wins this war, we will settle with you and your Gaullist friends." His assignment letter in hand, Ricard went off to keep his appointment with Major von Lobau, the German bureaucrat who loved Paris, at the Hôtel Majestic on the Avenue Kléber, at the ceremonial centre of the city, within sight of the Arc de Triomphe. The hotel was the nerve centre of the occupation. High-ranking German officials streamed in and out of the guarded doors as their grosse Mercedes cars, military drivers in attendance, stood waiting on the avenue. About von Lobau, Théodore had been cautionary. "He cannot be bribed," he'd said. "He will have to be manipulated. And though he will be wearing an army uniform, he in fact works for the SD, the Sicherheitsdienst, the real German intelligence service, the lawyer Schellenberg and his pack of fellow lawyers who have nothing to do with those brutes in the Gestapo." Von Lobau's office was on an upper floor, isolated from the busy offices that managed the occupation. A sign on the door said Propagandastaffel, a brass plate next to it, Major F.J. von Lobau. When von Lobau's orderly admitted him, Ricard entered a room that reflected the tastes of its occupant. This was not an office where plans for slaughter were issued, but the workplace of a sophisticated and intelligent administrator. Von Lobau awaited him at a low table on the other side of the room from his desk, where a coffee service, delicate china cups and saucers, dainty little silver spoons had been set out. Will you take coffee? Von Lobau said. Thank you, I will. Ricard replied. 1 lump or 2? Von Lobau said. Ricard took 2, sipped the coffee and found it perfect. Pre-war coffee. The real thing. Von Lobau was a distinctive-looking gentleman. In his 30s he had light blonde hair, heavy lips, and pale, almost colourless eyes with just the faintest touch of blue for colour. He could have been, Ricard thought, from the far north of Europe, maybe Estonia, somewhere up there. Put armour on him, give him a staff with a pennant, and you would have a Baltic knight of an earlier century. As Ricard sipped his coffee, the orderly entered the room and handed von Lobau a dossier, a stiff green cardboard folder. My dossier, Ricard thought. There it is. This was something one never expected to see. It was packed with typewritten papers, some of them stapled together, and copies, flimsies of issued documents. Merde, what's in there? Likely memoranda. We believe that subject Ricard, or on the night of the 9th of August. Perhaps information taken from his neighbours. We're not sure of her name, but she... Or from his concierge, his former teachers, friends, lovers, past and present. Von Lobau, his face without expression, opened the file and skimmed through the pages. As he read, he took a pencil in hand and idly tapped the eraser on the wood surface of his desk. Eventually he looked up from the dossier and said, May I see your assignment letter, Monsieur Ricard? Von Lobau scanned the letter quickly, then said, Vichy seems to approve of your work. To this opening, Ricard merely nodded. One would think you were on the side of General de Gaulle. I mean, from your books, one would think that, no? Yes, one would. Ricard said, But not now. You have changed sides. Had a political conversion? Not really, I no longer have a side. You know Mercutio's line from Romeo and Juliet, a plague on both your houses. That is what I've come to. French political opinion was so complex and combative. Both sides fought among themselves as much as they fought each other. Then, sometime in the 1930s, I gave up on it. I would glance at the front page of the newspaper, shake my head in despair, then proceed to the football. That, at least, I understood. This was utter bullshit, but von Lobau didn't care. It was his job, the power he had, that caused supplicants to make up stories they thought would work. Now he turned back a few more pages in the dossier and said, So, Monsieur Ricard, I see you are returning to journalism. Any reason for that? Books take a long time to write, and the money's slow in coming, so I spoke with an editor at Le Journal du Jour, and was assigned a newspaper story. The dedication of a new bridge in Lübeck. Would that be an interesting subject for you? One more human story, the world goes on. And I saw how I could make it good reading. Ceremonies have their own stories. There will be folk dancers, chubby girls in dirndls, and mayors wearing their official sashes, cars waiting on either side of the bridge, seeking the honour of being the first one to cross the new span, tugboats decorated with crepe paper blowing their steam whistles. And if I do this well, there will be another article in the future. Well, I say I must give you permission, and I will look forward to reading what you write. Thank you, Major von Lobau. And when you return, you might consider occasional visits to my office. There will always be coffee or something stronger, and we might discuss where you've been and who you've met. Journalists turn up everywhere. They encounter all sorts of people and situations that one would like to hear about. It is the mission of this office, one of them anyhow, to gain insight into French life, especially Parisian life. One can always use some extra money, and we would be pleased to help you out there. Our relationship would of course be confidential, most confidential. You may assure yourself of that. There was no time to insult a powerful officer, so Ricard pretended to consider the offer, then said, "Thank you, Major von Lobau. I will certainly think it over." No. From his desk drawer, von Lobau took various forms, filled them out, then applied this rubber stamp and that rubber stamp. "So, you are off to the dedication. I'm sure you will enjoy the folk dancing, the young maidens in their dirndls and the lederhosen. And be thoughtful about what you say on the subject of Germany. You wouldn't want to hurt my feelings, would you?" Of the thousands and thousands of secrets in Paris, Madame de la Boissière's private shop was one worth knowing. In her 40s, she had bright blonde hair, thin lips, and eager, restless eyes. Once upon a time, she had married an aristocrat who gambled away his fortune at the tables in Monte Carlo, then classically went into the garden and shot himself. This left his widow with a spacious apartment at the far end of the Jardin du Luxembourg, a multitude of rich friends, and no money. She had, however, a Parisian woman's feel for style, began to buy friends' clothing when they no longer wanted it, and soon had, standing wall to wall in her apartment, racks of beautifully tailored suits and dresses from fine little shops. For their trip into Germany, Ricard needed a new version of Kasha. So, off to Madame de la Boissière, who took one look at Kasha in her worker's cap and pea jacket, and said, "I have the very thing. She will be bon bourgeois in an hour." She was true to her word. Kasha stripped down to bra and panties. Madame de la Boissière stared as she did it, then took her firmly by the shoulders, turned her around, placed a firm hand across her bottom, and held it there as she said, "You have a sweet ass, dear." Kasha turned her head around and smiled at the compliment, then curved her back so that her bottom stood out for Madame de la Boissière to admire. Then Madame de la Boissière held up outfits for her to see, and soon enough moleskin trousers and ankle-high boots were replaced by a cream-coloured shirt, a brown wool suit, and tie-up Oxford shoes with chunky heels. Kasha was delighted with her new look, stood at the mirror, turned to see one profile, then another, and was clearly pleased. 3 days later, Paul Ricard and Kasha, his translator, at 10:08 in the morning, boarded the Paris-Brussels Express, headed after a change of trains for Lübeck, 40 miles from the submarine base at Kiel. 12th of November. In the rain, under a low, dark sky, chaos. Half the crowd around the Gare du Nord surged towards the station, the other half headed for home. This was not the same madness that struck every year on the first day of August, when almost all Paris headed away from the city at the same time, intent on not losing a minute of their August vacation. But this was November. Where was everybody going? Away. Occupied Paris was claustrophobic and difficult, so any excuse would do. Let's go see Tante Renée in Tours. Because of the coal shortage, only a few trains were running, and they were mobbed. Travellers packed the aisle that ran past the compartments. On the platforms, children were towed along by their parents. Travellers ran to make their trains. Couples hung on to each other in the mêlée, and the use of sharp elbows was common. As for the German soldiers among the crowd, space magically appeared before them. At last, after struggling to hear the staticky PA system, and having tried several platforms, Ricard and Kasha reached the train for Brussels. Ricard had meant to buy tickets for the express train, but these were long reserved, so it would be first class on the local. Eventually, Ricard and Kasha found their compartment, gratefully sank onto the faded red plush seats, and lit cigarettes of relief. Outside the grimy window, faces appeared, somebody searching for somebody, then vanished, As travellers found their seats, they immediately raised the windows to continue saying goodbye to those who had accompanied them to the station. Traffic on the platform was slowed by those passengers who never got on a train without asking the conductor where it was going. Finally, the conductors called out, "Tous à bord!" and travellers lingering on the platform hurried to climb the steps into the carriage. Ricard and Kasia thought they might have the compartment to themselves. But when the engine hissed as it vented steam, 2 Wehrmacht troopers entered the compartment, stowed their rifles, helmets and heavy duffel bags above their seats, and politely greeted Kasia and Ricard. These were German combat soldiers. Officers always took the express, even if a few poor souls had to be kicked off the train to make room for them. The troopers wore Feldgrau, field grey uniforms, with ribbons and medals pinned to their tunics. Likely they'd fought in the army that defeated France in 1940, had been assigned to occupation duty in one of the northern towns, then given furloughs in Paris before they went off to fight in Russia, 1,500 miles away. One of the soldiers took out photographs he'd had developed in Paris and showed them to his friend, who said, "Is that Sylvie?" Even with the subject upside down from where he sat, Ricard could see a plump redhead with a crooked smile. "That's her, in front of the bar in Pigalle." "Here's one of her friend." "Mimi." "Yes, with the big tits. God, I was drunk. They didn't care, they liked soldiers." Soon enough the troopers fell asleep, so Kasia and Ricard whispered to each other. "Merde, it is triste here," Kasia said, staring out of the window. She wasn't wrong. Heading for Brussels, the track ran northeast of Paris, flat fields in the November rain with only an occasional village, and soon enough the names of the towns were the names of the Great War battlefields. Amiens, Arras, Cambrai. This was, after all, Flanders, the cockpit of Europe, where armies had fought since the Middle Ages, killing each other with everything from crossbows to rifles. One Flemish farmer turning over the earth in his field had revealed a line of 12 bayonets, a squad caught in battle order as they moved down a trench and died frozen in place of a shell concussion. Outside the train window, a field of white crosses that took the train a long time to pass. "Nobody comes here, do they?" Kasia said. "The French know what happened here. They don't like to think about it. When Parisians get rich enough to buy a country house, they look west of Paris, near Rambouillet or Chevreuse. Too many bad memories here. An uncle dead in 1914, a brother a year later. The artillery barrages went on for days. They fired 1,000,000 shells. Still, when the French troops went over the top, German machine guns were waiting for them, day after day after day until the mutinies in 1918. Then the generals executed their own troops." Kasia said nothing, lit a cigarette, and watched the fields go by. The local train never went much over 30 miles an hour, stopping at stations only a few miles apart, village stations, serving villages on roads that for centuries had been reached by horse or foot, the roads still flanked by very old plane trees. Ricard said, "We'd better go and have something to eat," and the two went off to the dining car. The SNCF, Société Nationale des Chemins de Fer Français, had done the best it could. Pale green canned peas in a thin mayonnaise, a 2-egg omelette with spring onions, 4 pieces of bread in a straw basket, and a battered pear with 1 bad bruise. Ricard and Kasia were grateful for whatever was served, finished everything, then went back to their compartment. They were almost dozing, heard only the clatter of the train wheels, but the German troopers' hearing had been sharpened in battle, and they both woke up suddenly. "Scheiß!" one of them said. His companion pulled up the window, stuck his head out and looked up at the sky. Only now did Kasia and Ricard become aware of a low droning sound somewhere behind the train, a drone that became louder each second. "What is it?" Ricard said. The trooper replied in German, and Kasia translated. "It is the RAF. The British bombed this line." Suddenly the train sped up. "What's he doing?" Ricard said. The trooper, looking out of the window, said, "He's trying for a tunnel ahead of us. He can hide the locomotive under there." 2 bombs straddled the train, sending fountains of dirt into the air and blowing window glass into the compartment. Then the train stopped with a screech of air brakes. The trooper said, "The engineer has got the locomotive under the tunnel." Ricard touched a place beneath his eye, extracted a small shard of glass stuck in his cheek, dabbed at the blood with his handkerchief, then began to brush shattered glass off his trousers. From one of the cars ahead of them, a passenger dived out of a window, then rolled into a ditch by the side of the track. The British plane was a dive bomber, and the pilot, having dropped both of his bombs, now began to strafe the train from end to end. Bullets punctured the roof above Ricard's compartment. An orange tracer round penetrated the roof and passed on through the floor, leaving a hole in the wood and a wisp of brown smoke that curled up into the air. On his way back down the train, the British pilot saw the man hiding in the ditch, fired his machine guns, and the man stood up, then sat down and tilted slowly backwards. One of the German troopers retrieved his rifle, put a round in the breech, leaned out of the window and tried for a shot at the bomber. "Horst!" his companion said. "Don't make him mad!" And Horst sat back down. As the drone of the bomber's engine faded away, it was replaced by a quiet, rainy afternoon. From the edge of the field, crows called out as they flew above the trees. Some of the passengers left the train, as did Kasia and Ricard. Up ahead of them, where the train's engine had stopped under the tunnel, the driver stumbled out of his cab and sat on the embankment that supported the tracks, one hand held to his heart. A small spaniel had got away from its master and ran barking hysterically across the field. One of the passengers approached a conductor and said, "We have a dead woman in our compartment." "Which car were you in?" the conductor said. The passenger told him, and the conductor replied, "I'll bring a blanket and we'll cover her up. That's all we can do until we reach Brussels." It was 2:30 in the afternoon, with a slow, steady rain and low cloud that darkened the sky until the train stood in twilight. The driver, a conductor supporting him with an arm around his waist, returned to his cab and restarted the engine. Then, as the train gathered speed, a second British bomber appeared, first as a dot in the sky, then an aeroplane, losing altitude as it descended towards the railway track. At that moment the train was chugging around a long curve, and Ricard could see the cars ahead of him. He saw the first bomb miss, landing far to the left of the train. But on his second run the British pilot improved his aim, and a bomb fell next to the coal wagon behind the engine. Ricard saw its right side wheels rise into the air. Then the wagon fell on its side, crashing down the embankment and spilling its coal. But the coupling held, causing the passenger carriage next in line to go over as well. Then the engine fell, spewing steam in the air as it lay on its side, while the driver scrambled out of the window and jumped to the ground. Meanwhile, the following passenger carriages tilted over and tumbled down the embankment. Ricard, stunned, found himself lying on top of Kasia. The 2 troopers sprawled next to them. From a nearby carriage a woman screamed. Ricard managed to get to his feet, then said, "Are you all right?" Kasia raised her hands, and gently Ricard helped her to her feet. She looked down at the jacket of her new suit, which had survived intact, but Kasia brushed at it anyhow, saying,
"Those bastards! Don't they know we're on their side?"
"They don't worry about that. They're ordered to bomb a certain train, and that's what they do." Ricard now reached up and tried to open the window above his head, but it wouldn't budge. Standing next to him, the trooper called Horst said, "Cover your eyes," and with the butt of his rifle broke the window, careful to smash out the glass at the window's edge. Next he told Ricard to cup his hands. He put his foot on them and thrust himself upwards through the broken window. Then he lay flat on the side of the upturned carriages and reached inside. "The woman first," he said. Kasia was easy to lift. Briefcase in hand, she slid down the side of the car, stood in the field, and lit a cigarette. When Ricard had climbed through the window, he joined her.
"What happens now?"
she asked. As passengers left the train, they sat on the embankment, grateful to be alive. After an hour, on the far horizon, a convoy of grey-green trucks appeared, then stopped. "Ah, the Wehrmacht arrives," Horst said. Ricard helped Kasia to her feet, and they, among dozens of other passengers, began trudging across the field towards the trucks. On the night of the 12th of November, Ricard and Kasia wandered around Amsterdam, looking for a place to stay. Their train to Hamburg would leave on the morning of the 13th. But the city was busy, the hotels packed with Germans on leave. All they could find was a hotel room in Die Wahlen, the brothel district, where naked women sat behind windows in rooms painted red and lit by red light. In Ricard and Kasia's room was a single bed they could share, a wooden stool, and a lone bulb hanging from the ceiling on a cord. The madam who showed them to the room had grown fat a long time ago and wore a loosely tied floral print wrap. Eager for company, she invited them up to her apartment, where she produced 2 quart bottles of beer with ceramic plugs and 3 water glasses. "Where are you two coming from?" she said. "Paris," Ricard said.
"Ah, Paris,"
she said with a nostalgic smile.
"What's it like these days?"
"Occupied, but not too bad. The Boche want to keep it a playground for their troops on leave, so all the cinemas are open, and if you can afford it, there's good food to be had. Still, Germans everywhere."
"Don't like 'em?"
"Not much." Having established that the two shared her feelings for the Germans, she said,
"Do you like to listen to the radio?"
Ricard said they did.
"What time is it?"
she said. Ricard looked at his watch and said, "Almost 9 o'clock.
9 o'clock is always a good time to listen to the radio."
This took Ricard a moment to decipher, and it was Kasia who said,
"You mean the BBC, don't you?" "I do, sweetheart. I never miss it. I can get the French service here." She lumbered over to a small Emerson radio next to a fern in a pot and began to fuss with the dial. In a few minutes, they heard the 4 opening notes of Beethoven's 5th Symphony, ... Morse code for V, as in V for victory, that signalled the BBC broadcast. The announcer's voice was smooth and unemotional, the news itself hopeful, as though, Ricard thought, the war had begun to turn, 1 notch, no more, in the Allies' favour. The lead story: German forces had now occupied all of France, an acknowledgement that France would never be Germany's friendly neighbour, as the Germans had foolishly hoped. Next, British and American troops had invaded North Africa, landing on the beaches of Morocco and Algeria, heading for Casablanca, Algiers, and the Algerian city of Oran. From there, Ricard knew they could launch an invasion of Mussolini's Italy. Churchill, in a speech on the radio, had said, "This is not the end. This is not even the beginning of the end. But it is, perhaps, the end of the beginning." all in Churchill's deep, rumbling and fiercely inspiring voice. In the Pacific, American Marines had invaded the island of Guadalcanal, meaning to take the Japanese-built airstrip. Meanwhile, the Wehrmacht, fighting in waist-high frozen snow, could not break through the Russian lines that defended Stalingrad. When the broadcast ended, the madam of the Amsterdam brothel, with a broad smile on her fleshy face, raised her glass of beer and said, "To victory, my friends." Ricard and Kasia repeated the toast. Not long afterwards they returned to their room, stripped down to their underwear and crawled into the narrow bed, so narrow that the only way they could both fit on the lumpy mattress was to lie on their sides. Kasia tight against Ricard's back, her arm wrapped around his chest, the heat of her body warming his skin. Because it was dark in the room and silent in the blacked-out street, Kasia spoke in a whisper. "What train do we take tomorrow?" "The 208 from Central Station. We'll be in Emden by 6 or so." "Emden?" "The border post between Holland and Germany. Then we go on to Lübeck." "In Germany?" "That's where it is, my love." She was silent for a moment. "Do you worry about being in Germany?" "Yes." "But you go?" "Yes." "Why?" Ricard laughed. "It's a long story." "What will they do to us if we're caught?" "Throw us in jail, for starters. But I have an assignment letter and permission from the Propagandastaffel." "It will work." Ricard shrugged. "I believe it will." She brooded over this, then tightened her arm around Ricard's chest. "I'm frightened, Ricard. I don't show it. We Poles don't. We expect each other to be brave. But I've been in prison." Ricard reached back and pulled her closer. "We're not going to be arrested, Kasia. For what? Our papers are good. We haven't done anything wrong." She nodded, felt better, and not long after, her breathing changed, and she twitched and muttered in her sleep, kicked him once, then quietened down. Voyage to the Reich. At the border post in Emden, dusk, with night fast closing in. The rain had stopped and there were faded red streaks amid the dark clouds. A light wind toyed with the red and black swastika flags, and the passengers, leaving the train for document control, knew they were in Germany now. So they didn't say much, or spoke in undertones. A kind of hush on the German side of Emden, where guards in Wehrmacht uniform watched the passengers carefully, while their Alsatian shepherds strained at their leads. Chains attached to broad leather collars. They had been trained to attack civilians, and they wanted to do it. Ricard and Kasia stood patiently in the long queue, eventually reaching a junior officer who took their documents in hand. He was young, 19 or 20, likely a former member of the Hitlerjugend, the Nazi youth program which one entered at the age of 14. He certainly had the Aryan look, tall and pale, with steel-framed spectacles. Slapping Ricard's passport against his upturned palm, he said, "What brings you to the Reich?" The "you" was accented as though Ricard's mere existence was offensive. "I'm writing an article for a French newspaper," Ricard said. "You have a permit from the Propagandastaffel?" "Yes, sir." The officer didn't like Ricard. "Let's see it," he said. As Ricard rummaged through his briefcase, the officer rested his hand on the butt of his holstered pistol, ready to arrest Ricard, wanting to arrest him. Ricard found the letter and started to give it to the officer, but there was an interruption. A senior officer appeared from the customs shed, with a mousy little fellow held by the collar of his jacket and hauled upwards, so that he had to walk on his toes. Then the officer shouted at his subordinate, Klebner? What are you doing, Klebner? How did this little asshole, get past you? He's a smuggler, Klebner. He's got a suitcase full of stockings. Silk stockings! The officer's face was red with anger. Smuggling provocative clothing for women was worse than just smuggling. Klebner, a pink flush of shame on his cheeks, apologized to his superior. Taking hold of the man's shoulders, he spun him around, manacled his wrists, and began to march him away. The man, his voice high and pleading, said, "But, sir, I am just a simple salesman." Kasha began to whisper something to Ricard, but the officer yelled, "And you shut your mouth!" Klebner, with his prisoner halfway to a waiting van, turned and gave Ricard a look of pure hatred. The officer who'd yelled at Klebner took Ricard's papers, stamped them, and waved him through. As Ricard and Kasha walked over the border and headed for the train to Hamburg, Kasha said, "You are lucky today, Ricard. That was almost the end of you. He would have found something irregular with your permits. He intended to arrest you." Slowly, Ricard's pounding heart settled down. "I know," he said. They boarded the train and found a compartment in the second-class carriage. Ricard opened the window. The night air was chilly and damp. Then watched as other passengers trudged along the platform, suitcases in hand. They didn't speak. Turning to Kasha, Ricard said, "Kasha, why is it so quiet here?" "The Germans are afraid," she said. "They go to sleep afraid and they wake up afraid. That's Hitler and his Gestapo at work. That's the way they want it. They like fear." Ricard felt his anger return. "Hitler. Why doesn't somebody—" Kasha crossed his lips with her finger. "Don't," she said. In Lübeck, a bright, windy day at the River Trave, a banner hailing the new Heinrich Himmler Brücke snapped in the breeze, and the local dignitaries, sashes crossed from shoulder to waist, held on to their hats. In the crowd were wounded veterans of the Wehrmacht, one of them legless, seated on a wheeled trolley that he drove with gloved hands. Also in the crowd, local women who held tin cans rattled the coins inside and asked for donations to the Winterhilfe, which sent warm clothing to the soldiers fighting on the Russian front. The RAF had bombed Lübeck 7 months earlier, destroying the historic centre of the city and damaging the bridge, which had now been repaired. Thus the ceremony proceeded much as Ricard had imagined it would. A speech by a dignitary, followed by another speech by another dignitary. The crowd applauded enthusiastically. Then it was time for the Umpar band and the chubby maidens in their dirndls, folk-dancing girls who slapped thighs and shoulders in time to the music. As the dance ended and the mayor of Lübeck approached one of the ceremonial banners with giant scissors made of cardboard, a single-engine aeroplane passed overhead. The crowd looked up, saw no threat, but went silent until the plane flew over. Then the mayor, with the aid of a town clerk using real scissors, cut the ribbon, and the crowd cheered. 16th of November. In the morning, Ricard and Kasha had coffee in a little breakfast room in the basement of their hotel. When their coffees were served, they sipped at their cups and lit cigarettes. "So today," Ricard said, "we take a branch line train to Altona, which is joined to the city of Hamburg, and from there we go up to Kiel." "Have you ever been to Kiel?" "No, but I know about it. It's a major port on the Baltic Sea. The U-boat pens are in Kiel. So that's where somebody copied the engineering schematic. Some Polish labourer at a workshop in one of the Navy yards." For a moment, Kasha was thoughtful. "Do you think they will let us anywhere near the docks?" "I promise they won't. We'll have to find another way. The Poles are forced to work there, but they can come back to some sort of camp at night. So we can look for a place where they gather to drink." Ricard glanced at his watch and said, "Time to leave for our train." In Altona, Ricard and Kasia found the railway station near the centre of the town, learned that their train would leave in an hour, and settled in the waiting room. Kasia said, "Can't we find the railway timetable? That would make life easier." It would. Before the war they were in every station, but the Germans don't want the RAF to know the train schedule, so the timetables disappeared. In the waiting room, sailors and officers of the Kriegsmarine, the German Navy, looking smart in their well-tailored dark blue uniforms, as well as the usual crowd of weary travellers sitting by their suitcases. Also in the crowd, 2 men in their 30s, perhaps, wearing civilian suits and grey felt hats. These two struck Ricard as slightly unusual. Men in Germany were typically in uniform. But perhaps these two were officials of some sort, headed up to Kiel on state business. They didn't have briefcases, however, and they weren't reading newspapers or talking. And on closer inspection, they weren't really the official type. They could have been soldiers, big guys with hard faces, but they looked more like policemen, like detectives. "You're watching the two over there," Kasia said. "I was trying to do it covertly." "You weren't succeeding, and in a minute they're going to come over here and say hello." Ricard looked down at his shoes. "How's this?" "Much smarter. You were staring at secret police, and secret police don't like to be stared at."
End of Disc 2. Disc 3.
On a chalkboard at the front of the waiting room, a station worker wrote that the train for Kiel would be delayed. "Merde," Kasia said. "Maybe it's been bombed." "Some train will show up," Ricard said. "They have to keep the railways running." "Excuse me, sir." In the aisle that ran past the bench where Ricard was sitting, a young man with carefully combed reddish-blonde hair and a bright smile held an unlit cigarette in his lips. "Have you a light?" he said. Ricard took a small box of wooden matches from his pocket and lit the man's cigarette. "Thank you," he said. "Going up to Kiel together, are we?" He wasn't precisely rude, more overfamiliar, his tone knowing and smug. "We are," Ricard said. "We were in Lübeck for a story about the Trave River Bridge, and we thought we'd walk around Kiel for a while. Maybe have lunch. It's an interesting city, Kiel. Our Baltic fleet is based there. As it's at the foot of a long canal, merchant shipping can steam down from the sea, but the storms stay where they belong, over the open water. Do you have friends there? If you tell me their names, I might know them. I know so many nice people in Kiel." After a moment, Ricard said, "I don't believe we know anybody in Kiel." His tone softly defiant. Agent provocateur, he thought. "And what about you, young lady? Perhaps you have a friend or two." "I don't," Kasia said shortly. This intrusive man was getting on her nerves, and, she sensed, he was threatening her behind his bright smile. "Well, maybe we'll run into each other. It's a small world, as they say." "It is," Ricard said. "Go away." "Then I wish you a good afternoon," the man said, and walked towards the back of the waiting room. "One more secret agent," Kasia said. "This place is crawling with them." "He surely wanted us to know what he was." "Oh yes, he's all technique," Kasia said sourly. "I'm done with this country, Ricard. I want to go back to Paris, where I belong." Just then, their train was announced, and the two found an empty compartment. As they waited for the train to depart, there was a tap-tap on the window, and Kasia looked out to see the young man with reddish hair waving to them. He then moved away, up the platform, heading for a different carriage. 2 hours later they were in Kiel. At the station, the usual border guards had been replaced by SS men in their black uniforms and silver skull insignia. It was their presence itself that was threatening. They wanted to get you alone somewhere. Just at that moment they had to serve as border guards, but they had business with you and they would finish it. Ricard and Kasia parried them with courtesy until the guards produced their document stamp. Ricard and Kasia left the station, relieved that they hadn't been arrested. But then, 2 blocks further on, they were stopped at another control, this one supervised by detectives in civilian suits. No stamp this time, only long and careful looks. A few poor souls were taken out of line and searched, but Ricard and Kasia were not among them. After the 2 had been permitted to pass, Kasia said, "I have a bad feeling, Ricard. Let's go home." "Not yet. We have a job to do here. We should at least have a look at the port." They followed Feldstrasse until the tall cranes of the port came into view, then turned right and found themselves on the broad street that ran along the waterfront. Here and there a wharf had burned to blackened timbers, while 2 cargo ships, half sunk and floating on their sides, rose and fell with the current. Across the street, some of the warehouses had been bombed out, their brick facades spilled out into the street. Even so, the port was busy. Freighters were docked in a long row. Some of their names were Scandinavian, some Spanish, some Portuguese. Ships of neutral countries. Along the wharf, tall cranes bearing nets, worked by stevedores, were loading and unloading cargo. On the tops of the buildings across the street from the wharves, anti-aircraft positions, Bofors guns, manned by gunners and servers in circular tin helmets. At the far end of the street was a row of bars, ready for the workers when they got off shift. "Let's try one of the bars," Ricard said. "Maybe somebody knows where the poles are kept." As they headed for the bars, they saw a small ferry landing with a sign bolted to a piling. Here departure times for ferries to Norway, Denmark and Sweden. Occupied Denmark, Ricard thought. Occupied Norway. Neutral Sweden. Walking past the bars, Ricard said, "Look, here's one for the dock workers." The bar was called Das Haken, the hook, and painted on a wooden sign above the door was a longshoreman's steel hook with a wooden handle. As the 2 entered, conversation stopped, while the patrons, in workmen's clothes with tweed caps, stared at them. Strangers. Ricard and Kasia stood by the end of the bar near the door. In time, the barman had to acknowledge them. "Yes," he said. "What can I get for you?" "Beer," Ricard said. "For my friend as well." The barman drew 2 beers from a tap, then brushed the foam off the top with a wooden stick. As he finished, Ricard said, "Any Polish bars around here?" The barman stared at him. "My friend here's Polish, and looking for her brother who was working as a stevedore." "Can't help you," the barman said. Clearly, strangers asking questions weren't welcome at Das Haken. Ricard and Kasia left the bar and headed up the street. They hadn't gone far when one of the bar's patrons, an older man with a seamed face and hands knotted by a lifetime of handling cargo, came trotting after them. As he caught up, he said, "Keep walking." They took a few steps. Then he said, "That son of a bitch wouldn't help you if you were on fire. There are Poles here. The Nazis rounded them up and brought them to Kiel and forced them to work. They are machinists, tool and die men, welders, electricians. And there is a place where they gather, a sort of bar, in an old workshop, down an alley behind the warehouse on Kieler Schloss Street. It's owned by a man called Josef. but there's no name on the door." After Ricard thanked him, the old man said, "Be careful, comrades. This isn't a good place to ask questions." He took a step back towards the bar, then turned and raised a stiff arm with a closed fist. The International Communist salute. By now the sun had set and dusk was closing in. On the wharves, work continued, winches straining and grinding, warning whistles sharp in the air as cargo nets swung between the freighters and the dock. A splintering crash caught Ricard's attention. A crate had slipped from its net and fallen to the dock, spilling out newly manufactured rifles wrapped in oiled paper. "They feed the war here," Ricard said. Kasia nodded and said, "They do, and if it ever ends, they will start another." They walked for a time, both of them squinting up at the street signs in the twilight. Finally, the Kieler Schloss. The warehouse here had been hit in the bombing. Some of its windows had been blown out. There were scorch marks flared out on the wall below them, and the air smelled of old fire. The building's door was boarded up, and there was a handwritten sign on a piece of cardboard nailed to a board. Hoffmann und Schulz, Customs Brokerage, Import-Export. Formerly Schapera and Goldman. Behind the warehouse, a narrow alley where a tarmacked walkway led to an abandoned machine shop, a shack with a rusted tin roof. Ricard nodded, and the door opened to reveal a room lit by 2 candles, with a dirt floor and 6 rough-carpentered tables with benches. Along with the smell of stale cigarette smoke, a faint scent of burned metal. 2 men sat on one of the benches holding shot glasses of vodka. A third stood serving as bartender, Józef's bar. Kasia greeted them in Polish, and they responded. Then the man behind the table said, "Would you care for a vodka?" "We would, thank you," Kasia said. "You come here from Poland?" "From France, up in Lille, where the Polish miners work." Józef nodded and poured out 2 shot glasses of vodka. Kasia raised her glass and said, "Na zdrowie." "To your health." The men repeated the toast, as did Ricard. "Very good. What shall we pay you?" 2 sous a glass." "Very reasonable, my friend." "Well, I make it myself." When Ricard drank off his vodka, it burned like fire, all the way down. "Have one with us?" Kasia said. "Don't mind if I do." Józef poured the shots from a thick glass bottle with no label. Once again, "Na zdrowie." Kasia spoke French to Ricard, and he paid for the drinks. "I was wondering," Kasia said in Polish. "A friend of mine got a letter. It came by hand all the way to Paris. We're not sure who wrote it. Maybe someone who works over here, but it made us curious." "Us?" "My friend Ricard here, and me. I'm called Kasia." "He's maybe an official?" By way of not saying policeman. Kasia laughed. "Him? No. He's just a friend of mine from Paris. He writes books." She knew this would hit home. Poles greatly admired intellectuals. "Then you are welcome here," Józef said in French. Kasia said in Polish, "This letter was about his work. Whoever wrote the letter, his work building submarines." Józef turned to his friends. "Do we know anybody like that?" The men shook their heads, but Józef met Ricard's eyes, and Ricard immediately understood that it had been he who had copied the schematic. "Perhaps," Ricard said. "If you discover who it was, you can find a way to let me know." He produced a small pad, tore out a page and wrote down his address on the Rue de la Huchette. From somewhere outside, the mournful call of a ship's horn sounded 3 times. "What's that?" Ricard said. Come outside, you can hear it better." When the three stood in the walkway, the sound was repeated. "Kriegsmarine ships," Josef said, "putting out to sea." "Josef," Ricard said, "how do you come to be here?" In the moonlight they could see a rueful smile. Josef was of medium height, wore a tight beard, his wire-frame spectacles bent slightly out of shape. He had a strong, thereby handsome face, with a determined forehead beneath a receding hairline. He could have been, Ricard thought, an intellectual, something of the professor in the way he looked, a professor in a former life. Ricard lit a cigarette and gave one to Josef. "There are about 30 of us here. We were all taken prisoner during the invasion of France. The Germans shot the intellectuals, potential leaders, but they missed me for some reason. I told them I was an electrician. Actually, I had taught economics at the University of Krakow. Yet you persuaded them that you were a real electrician. I worked next to a real one. He showed me how to do the wiring. Anyhow, in time they took the technicians and put us to work out here. In the beginning they treated us badly, but the work slowed down, so they gave us some freedom. That's how I came to have the bar." "I thought forced labor meant barbed wire. Guards with truncheons, prisoners worked to death," Ricard said. "It does mean that. But not here. Here there are skilled technicians, too important to the German war effort to control with such brutalities. They need us, so we don't live in barracks behind barbed wire. They put us in an old school, abandoned a long time ago. We don't have much heat, but we gather coal on the railway tracks. Some always falls off the coal wagon." "What happened to the Germans who used to work here?" "In Russia, freezing to death at Stalingrad. There are tens of thousands of Frenchmen working in Germany, taking their places. Belgians, Dutchmen, Poles. Europe is part of the German Empire now. For how long I don't know, but it's like the last war. We wait for the Americans to show up." "Tell me, Josef," Ricard said, "is there somewhere we can stay in Kiel?" "You've seen the bars along the wharf. Try there. They often have an empty room on the second floor, and they let people spend the night for a few Reichsmarks." Walking back along the tarmacked path, Kasia said, "They must know here when the German ships sail. Isn't that valuable information?" "It's something," Ricard answered. "But if somebody knew what ships they were, that would be very valuable. I'll pass along the information." Josef served a final vodka to his patrons. Then at 10 in the evening he closed the bar and locked the door. A sharp wind blew onshore from the canal, which meant rain would follow. But weather was not going to keep him from his evening retreat. As usual, he walked away from the waterfront and climbed a high hill. From the crest, beneath a near full moon and a starlit, cloudless sky, the Kiel Canal was easily visible, its water calm and black. Glancing at a pocket watch he had bought from a friend, he saw that he had a few minutes before he had to return to the school. He didn't want to be caught breaking curfew. The Polish workers were tightly guarded by a Ukrainian SS unit. Teenagers, most of them, who were not interested in excuses, and used their fists freely. Josef didn't want to be smacked about, so he checked the time once more. It was quiet up on the hill, the only sound, the whisper of the nighttime wind in the tall weeds. Here was where Josef came to think about his former life, his wife and child, his apartment in Krakow, the office at the university where he'd prepared his lectures, and the coffee room down the hall. He'd liked to spend time there, gossiping with his fellow professors, avoiding university politics as much as possible, flirting with the secretaries. All that was gone. He'd been separated from his family when, after being taken prisoner, they'd been put on different trains, sent to different camps. Were they alive or dead? He didn't know. The University of Krakow had been closed. His apartment in Krakow was now occupied by a German officer and his mistress. This might change, he knew, when the war ended. But for now, what he could do was fight back. So as soon as he went to Kiel to work building the U-boats, he began hand-copying the workings of a torpedo detonator, then gave the schematic to a fellow prisoner who claimed to have a way of communicating with the Polish émigrés in Paris. They would know what to do with it. Get it, somehow, to the British. Looking down the hill, he saw another U-boat, which sounded its horn as it left port. He knew where it was going, up the canal, out into the Baltic, then through the Skagerrak, an arm of the North Sea between Norway and Sweden, then out into the sea. The U-boat would then head up the west coast of Norway and turn northeast, where it would hunt the convoys of British freighters and the shipping of other nations as well that brought arms, food and oil to ports of Russia, to Murmansk and Archangel, making it possible for Russia to continue fighting the Germans. Josef watched as down below on the canal the U-boat continued its slow progress towards the Baltic. In the darkness he could just make out a number painted near the top of the conning tower, but he couldn't read it. For that he would need some optical device. There was such a thing, he'd heard. Special binoculars, large and ungainly, known as night glasses. If he'd had those, he thought, he could have truly spied on the U-boats, sending the identification, the number, the time and the date to the British, who tracked every ship in the Kriegsmarine. Putting such information into British hands would be difficult and dangerous, he knew, but he could, if he had the night glasses, make war on his captors. It began to rain, just a light rain that pattered down on the hillside, and now it really was time to leave his refuge. So very reluctantly he walked slowly down the hill towards the abandoned school, where the Poles now lived. Ricard and Kasia walked along the wharf, trying to decide which bar had a room it rented out. To the east they could see a mowed strip of land that led to a chain-link fence with barbed wire woven through it. Then, above the chain-link, 3 separate strands of wire. On the fence a weathered sign, a red skull and crossbones next to the word Achtung. Below it a warning, passage beyond this point is forbidden on pain of death. Beyond the wire a high brick wall. That's the naval base, Ricard said. Finally, in the middle of the wharf, they chose a bar with a carefully hand-painted sign, a bearded sailor peering through a telescope. They started to show their papers to the barman, but he waved them off. "You have a bed for us?" Ricard said. "Yeah, there's a room on the 2nd floor. 10 Reichsmarks for the night." As Ricard paid, a black Opel pulled up to the door, paused, then crossed the wharf and parked. But the driver remained in the car. Ricard didn't think much of it. He was very tired, and he wanted to sleep. "Is there anything to eat?" Kasia asked the barman. "I can get you some cheese and bread and a bottle of beer." "We'll take it up to the room with us," Kasia said. Kasia liked to walk around while she ate. Using a knife that had been included with their meal, Kasia cut off a piece of the orange cheese, then slid it off the blade, and as she began chewing, she wandered idly over to the window and stared out at the car as she ate. She cut a piece of the dense black bread, handed it to Ricard, and said, "Who is that out there, do you suppose?" Ricard stood by her side at the window. "No idea." "To do with us?" Kasia shrugged. Then the Opel's driver's side window was rolled down, and the young man with the reddish hair seemed to be looking directly at them. "Oh, it's him," Ricard said. Maybe it's time to get out of here. Together they left the room and hurried downstairs to the bar, tired workers drinking beer, and took the back door, which opened on an alley with puddles of black water and fragrant rubbish bins. From under a stairway a cat scampered away. Where to hide? Kasia said. Did you see a sign on the ferry dock that said Sweden? Ricard said. Yes, there's a ferry waiting at the dock, Kasia said. But maybe it's going to Denmark. Occupied Denmark. We'll have to take our chances, Ricard said. Anywhere but here, as the saying goes. From an open space between buildings they could see the small ferry, an ancient tub from a Popeye cartoon, puffs of black smoke rising from its crooked smokestack. Now the driver of the Opel signalled to a stevedore occupied with coiling a tarred rope. The man came to the driver's window and the driver showed him a sheet of paper. Bet you 10 francs that's a wanted poster with a photograph, Kasia said. Guess who? Merde, Ricard said. Merde, indeed, Kasia said. We've got the fucking Gestapo after us. They've always got photographs. We'll have to cross the wharf to get to the ferry, Ricard said. They left the alley and headed towards the ferry dock. From the Opel, 2 little taps on the horn. Beep, beep. When they turned to look at the car, the driver crooked a finger and beckoned to them. Time to leave, Ricard said. They walked faster, taking an angle which would lead them behind the boot of the car. The driver waited, then, playing with them, began to back up, very slowly. The 2 walked away from the car. The Opel followed. Passing a freighter moored to the dock, Ricard saw a toolbox with an open lid, apparently belonging to a workman serving one of the winches. From a heap of tools in the box, Ricard took a pair of shiny steel pliers. Go and talk to him, Ricard said. Then wave me over. Kasia went to the driver's window and the man with the reddish hair turned towards her. What do you want with us? She said. The man opened his jacket to show Kasia an automatic in a shoulder holster. Get in the car, he said. Don't make me shoot you. We need to have a conversation. In the car? Both of us? Yes. All right, I'll get my friend, she said, and signalled to Ricard, who walked quickly, pretending to be worried and scared, over to the car. To see directly inside the car, he had to bend his knees. Momentarily, the man's face relaxed. These people were going to obey him. Then Ricard hit him between the eyes with the pliers. Hit him harder than he'd intended, and the man's eyes rolled up and he collapsed sideways, draped across the front seat, out cold. Kasia rolled up the window and locked the door. Ricard followed her example on the other side of the Opel. As they boarded the ferry to Sweden, there was a crowd at the bow railing, waving goodbye to friends, calling out Wiedersehen, Wiedersehen, and last-minute messages. Meanwhile, Ricard and Kasia watched the Opel. What if he comes too? Kasia said. He'll come staggering out of the car, calling for the police, and we shall be arrested. But if he remains undiscovered and the captain of this ship ever decides to sail, we will be leaving Germany. And I doubt we will return. Anyhow, cross your fingers, I hit him pretty hard. Out on the wharf, some passers-by did notice the car. A few of them peered inside, tapped on the window, then walked away. One man grabbed the door handle and yanked hard, but the lock held, while the next volunteer turned to his friend and made the classic gesture, fist with thumb extended, hand tilted above the mouth. He's drunk. He was followed by a policeman on a bicycle, who stopped to examine the situation, tried both doors, then shrugged and rode away. One big, brawny stevedore spent quite a while with the Opel, finally yelled, "Everything all right?" and returned to work. A few minutes later, as Ricard breathed a sigh of relief, the ferry sailed.
Layla. At last, back in Paris. Ricard unlocked the door to his apartment to find a thick sunbeam with dust motes drifting through it, shining in the window. By the typewriter on his desk, a stack of paper titled The Investigator. He read part of a page, then part of another, saw something that had to be changed, reached for a pencil and crossed out a word. Then he opened the window and the street life of the city flowed in, barking dogs, mothers yelling out of the window at their kids, the itinerant scissors sharpener calling out for customers, and that certain, very particular scent the city wore, compounded of age and dust and sewers and perfume and Gauloise smoke and potatoes frying in oil. Ricard inhaled deeply and knew he was home. He sprawled out on his bed, closed his eyes, and let the return to Paris gather in his heart. But not for long. When he thought of what he had to do that evening, his spirits sank a little. Anne Legros, the editor at Éditions Montrésor he liked, was leaving Paris. He looked at his watch and saw that it was almost 4 o'clock when the shops would reopen after the midday closure. He looped and knotted a grey wool scarf around his neck, tucked the ends inside his corduroy jacket, put on a pair of gloves, found the ration stamp book in his desk drawer, took the string bag that hung on the doorknob, and headed out. There was an open-air market at the nearby Place Maubert, but it was the wrong day for that, so he would take the Pont Marie across the Seine, then head for the Rue Saint-Antoine, his favourite shopping street. He paused for a time midway across the Pont Marie and stared down at the heavy current in the Seine, the water grey beneath a grey November sky. His reverie was interrupted by a German patrol boat cruising up the river. Fucking war, he thought. You can't escape it. On the Rue Saint-Antoine, he stopped at the Crèmerie, where the owner offered him a wedge of mimolette, a hard orange cheese, from under the counter. Expensive, she told him, but ripe for supper tonight. He bought the mimolette. Next he visited the butcher and bought a short length of sausage, then stopped at the boulangerie for a wedge of pain de campagne, a bread that would last forever. For his final stop he went to a wine shop and bought a bottle of red wine, the best he could afford. Then he returned to the Rue de la Huchette, and with newspaper and twine, made a secure bundle of his purchases. It was close to 6 and dark by the time he reached the building in the 6th arrondissement where Anne Legros lived. He'd called, and she was waiting for him in front of her building. "So," he said after greeting her, "you're on your way south?" "Yes, to my aunt's house in Laconne." As they walked to the métro that would take them to the Gare de Lyon, he said, "What's it like there in Laconne?" "Just the usual petit village. Everybody knows everybody else. Very quiet, very peaceful, no bush to be seen, so no controls, no demands for papers. My aunt has the tabac in the village, and I will work there and live in the big old house she has at the edge of town." "So then, no more Éditions Montrésor. I'm sure they're sorry to see you go." "They are, but I can't stay in Paris any longer. With all the Germans and the Gestapo, I began to get a bad feeling as though something awful was going to happen. When I saw people taken away in the Gestapo vans, I thought someday that will be me. So farewell to Paris, as much as I love it. But you will stay?" "As long as I can," Ricard said. "I was born here. I belong to the city." They rode the métro to the Gare de Lyon and fought their way through the crowd to the train for Orléans, the first leg of Madame Legros' voyage to the south. Then walked along the platform to a coach that wasn't yet jammed with passengers. "I'm sorry to see you go," Ricard said. "I'm sorry to leave, but it's for the best."
Ricard handed her the newspaper parcel of food and said, "You'll be on the trains for a day or two, so I brought you something to eat."
"Thank you, Ricard," she said. "You are a good soul."
They embraced. Madame Legros climbed the first step to the train, turned and waved, and then she was gone. It was early December, a dusting of new snow on the ground. The Schönbrunn Grundschule High School, where the Poles lived, stood isolated and dark in what had once been a village adjacent to the city of Kiel. Not much left of the village now. The RAF bombers came in 1940. The school stood among a few remnants of brick wall, with weeds growing where a building had stood. The school itself had been built in the middle of the 19th century, with Schönbrunn Grundschule chiselled into the elaborate stonework below the roof. The teachers of those days had likely been a formidable group, bearded men who wore pince-nez and stiff collars, droning away in their classrooms as the students sat at attention. Abandoned in 1910, the school had been reopened as a barracks for the Polish labourers sent to Germany to build submarines. 30 cots spread among the classrooms, old WCs brought back to working order. On that night in early December, Józef and 3 other workers waited for their Ukrainian guards to go to sleep, then held a meeting and talked about resistance, how to fight back against the Germans. Soon the conversations centered on their work on the torpedo detonators they built for the Germans. "Why not?" one of them suggested. "Build an extra one and hand it over to the British." The detonator was 8 inches in height. Its exterior surface made of highly polished chrome steel. The front end, the top, was curved, while the flat bottom had 4 holes bored in it, where electrical cables would be plugged in when the torpedo was put together. The device was sensitive to contact, or to depth and distance, and once it had reached a ship, it would set off the explosive in the torpedo, blowing a 10-foot hole in the hull and sending the ship to the bottom. The Polish workers would have to fabricate this device for every torpedo they constructed. And, aware that it was important to the German war effort, they had decided to build one for the British. This was espionage, and could get them arrested and tortured, but they didn't care. They were Poles, Polish patriots, so they fought their enemies. To get the device to the British Secret Service, they would have to take it to Paris. And for this job they chose as courier one of their number called Ostrov. His documents for the trip were created by substituting his name and description on papers belonging to one of the other workers. The money for his journey stolen from shops in the city of Kiel. A few years earlier, before the attack on Poland in 1939, Ostrov had worked as a welder in the shipyards of Gdynia on Poland's Baltic coast. Then he'd been captured during the invasion of Poland, and, having a trade the Germans needed, was spared prison camp and sent to the naval shipyards in Kiel. On the train from Hamburg to Paris, by way of changes in Emden and Brussels, Ostrov stood in the packed aisle, hand tight on his small valise. It was the common version of a valise, tan, pliable canvas with handle and buckled straps made of cheap leather. What made it unusual was that it held a detonator, wrapped in well-used underwear to discourage customs officers. Ostrov himself would be of little interest to the officers. He looked like a typical worker, a short man who wore an oil-stained cap with tufts of grey hair sticking out above his ears, an old blue winter jacket, and oil-stained shoes with newspaper stuffed inside because the soles were tearing away, and his feet were cold. Then, at the customs inspection on the German side of Emden, his luck ran out. The German inspector was 52. He'd begun his job at the age of 23. He'd seen everything, so he knew instinctively when a traveller had contraband, morphine, weapons, stolen gems. He'd seen it all. But what annoyed the inspector most of all was that he was now facing a Pole, a subhuman, according to Nazi doctrine. "Open your valise." The inspector used the eraser end of a pencil to probe through the clothes in Ostrov's valise. He turned up the underwear-wrapped detonator, told Ostrov to unwrap it, then said, "What's this?" Ostrov had been well coached by the other Poles at Kiel, and the question wasn't unexpected. "An oil pump for a sports car," he said. "It's for a friend of mine in Paris. He's got some fancy Italian car. It can go 150 miles an hour." The inspector wasn't sure about it, and did what in such cases he'd been told to do. He met the eyes of one of the Gestapo men observing the line. The officer was young and wore a blue suit, with his hair combed up in a pompadour. This man confirmed the inspector's gesture, waited as Ostrov had his exit visa stamped, then followed him as he left the office, and stood waiting on the platform for the train to Brussels. Here, Ostrov found himself standing next to a middle-aged woman with a leather case. "Gold today," Ostrov said, rubbing his hands. The woman looked him over and decided he wasn't someone she would answer. The man in the blue suit signalled to a colleague and nodded at the woman. "Find out who she is." The man in the blue suit's colleague, a Gestapo officer wearing a leather jacket, approached the woman, showed a badge, and wrote down her name, address, and passport number. The train for Brussels pulled in a few minutes later. It was already crowded, and Ostrov had to push his way past passengers riding on the iron steps that led to the carriage vestibule. "Excuse me," he said, polite words accompanying very impolite pushes and shoves. The passengers inside were as usual, war-weary, unsmiling, stiff and cold after hours of standing on the train, muttering under their breath as Ostrov forced his way among them. Life was easier for the men following him. They showed badges, and people squeezed themselves out of their way. Finally, a conductor, using both hands and a shoe, forced travellers on the steps up into the crowded vestibule and signalled to the driver. Slowly, the overloaded train began to move. It rattled past harvested fields, where grey light reflected off pools of standing water under a low, dark sky, past long stretches of winter weeds bending in the wind, past forests of trees with bare branches, past the empty streets of the occasional village. On the train, the passengers stared out at the flat, featureless landscape. They were 180 miles from Paris, 6 hours on the slow train. But it took longer. Just after entering Holland, the train reached a section of track that had been blown up by RAF bombers or resistance saboteurs. And here the train was led by a railwayman who walked ahead of the engine and waved it forward over track that had been newly laid. The train crept along, bumping over temporary connections that the railway crews had installed. The passengers were silent, keeping their opinions of bombers and saboteurs to themselves. It was 9 in the evening before the train arrived at the Gare du Nord, and the passengers were at last released from captivity. Kasia and Ricard were waiting for Ostrov on the platform. They'd had a letter describing him. "My uncle will arrive," and they knew what he looked like. They watched him leave the train, and they saw the 2 officers following him. Who were these travellers? Solidly built and self-confident young fellows with no luggage and busy eyes. "He's being followed," Ricard said. "The guy in the blue suit? That's a Gestapo thug, I'd bet my life on it." "I see him," Kasia said, "and the other one, in the leather jacket." Ostrov peered down the platform. Jozef had described the young woman he was supposed to meet, and when he saw Kasia, he started to approach her. But she merely glanced at him, then looked away. Was he mistaken? Was there another attractive woman with short hair wearing a brown suit? Ostrov didn't see her. Now what? He waited while the arriving passengers met family or friends, waited while others headed for the taxi queue outside the station. Meanwhile, the two Gestapo officers watched the platform and waited for Ostrov to meet somebody or head off into the city. Kasia swore under her breath. She could see the valise. She knew what was inside, but to acknowledge Ostrov at this point was to be arrested. Still, they couldn't just leave him standing there, by now nearly alone as the other passengers dispersed. Finally, Ricard said, "We have to get that valise." "How?" Kasia said. "Let's steal it." Ricard said, "Such things happen around railway stations." "What about the Gestapo escort?" Kasia said. "We'll lose them. Go talk to him." Kasia headed for Ostrov. When she reached him, she said, "Welcome to Paris, monsieur. Are you seeking a taxi? My friend is waiting just around the corner." "What, a taxi? No, aren't you the woman I'm—" Ricard came up on the other side of Ostrov, deftly removed the valise from his fingers, and hurried away towards the Boulevard de Magenta. Both Gestapo officers followed Ricard and the valise. There were Parisian policemen here and there, but the German officers knew they couldn't depend on help from the French. They could have arrested Ostrov. As Gestapo men, they could have arrested anyone they liked. But they wanted his contact. Who would receive the valise? Meanwhile, Ostrov started to run after Ricard, but Kasia grabbed him by the back of his coat. "Time for you to disappear," she said in Polish. Pressing a wad of francs into his hand, she said, "Here's money for your things." Then she ran and caught up with Ricard, who was in turn being trailed by the two officers. By now, Ricard was walking fast, and saw in a cafe window that his pursuers were closing in on him. "Now we split up," he said to Kasia. "Meet me back at the gare." Kasia, a lot faster than Ricard, turned suddenly and ran across the street, but the Gestapo officers ignored her and followed Ricard and the valise. Ricard now began to panic and broke into a run, but he was 40, and they were in their 20s, and he wasn't going to outdistance them. He looked up at the boulevard and spotted an approaching taxi, the usual wood-fired engine set atop its roof. The taxi slowed as it neared a sharp corner. Ricard pulled the door open and sprawled full length across the back seat. Or rather, across the laps of the two people sitting in the back seat. A glamorous woman in a hat with a veil, who yelped as Ricard landed on her, and an older man, a Parisian dandy, a gent with a white moustache curled up at the ends, who wore a white suit over a waistcoat with fleur-de-lis designs on white silk. He also had an ornate walking stick with which he began to beat Ricard, shouting insults at him in upper-class French. The taxi jerked to a stop, and the driver scurried to the back seat, grabbed Ricard by the shoulders, and attempted to pull him out, but Ricard swung the valise and smacked him full on the nose, which began to bleed copiously. From the older gent, the French equivalent of, "Damn you, sir, have you no manners?" Now a flic came running and blowing his whistle. Ricard didn't wait for more police to arrive. He slid the rest of the way out of the car, ran around to the driver's seat and put the car in gear. The woman squawked, "Maurice, we are being kidnapped! Do something!" From behind, Maurice hit Ricard on the top of his head. Ricard saw stars, then stopped the taxi and punched the white-haired gent in the forehead. Shaking his hand, hurt by the impact, Ricard said, "I'm with the resistance. I'm being followed." "Go resist somewhere else," the gent yelled, and swung his stick back for another blow, as once again a police whistle sounded. Ricard dragged him out of the taxi, set him on the pavement, put a foot behind his heel, and gave him a good shove. The man tumbled backwards with a curse. Ricard jumped into the taxi and drove off. From the back seat, the gent's companion cried out, "Please, sir, let me go. I'll give you money." Behind the taxi, a police car approached, its two-tone klaxon horn honking away, and drew abreast of the taxi. From the passenger seat, the Gestapo man in the blue suit shook his fist at Ricard, who turned hard left and slammed the taxi into the police car. Both vehicles mounted the curb. The police car skidded to a stop in front of a building, and the taxi hit a street lamp, which broke the lamp from its standard and sent it crashing down on the taxi's roof. Ricard grabbed the valise and took off, running down the boulevard. Almost immediately he found himself by a department store and hurried inside. The perfume counter was near the entry, and a saleswoman, speaking from a cloud of scent, said, "Monsieur, do you need help? You are injured." Ricard realized that his forehead was wet, and drew a finger across it, which came away red. "I'm running from the bush," he said to the woman, who made a sound of sympathy, and began wiping Ricard's forehead with a facial tissue, then handed him another. "Take the lift," she said. "We have 5 floors." As Ricard waited by the lift, he heard a commotion at the front of the store. The Gestapo had arrived. He watched the needle above the lift door as it descended. 4th floor, 3rd, 2nd. And there it stopped. Behind him he heard running footsteps. Then the needle began to descend. The door opened automatically, and the lift operator, wearing white gloves, slid the gate aside. A small crowd entered the lift, and just before the gate was closed, so did the Gestapo man in the leather jacket. The lift car filled with shoppers. Ricard stood against the side of the car, with several people between him and the Gestapo officer. Ricard dabbed at his hairline with the tissue. Then the man in the leather jacket spoke, his French bearing a heavy German accent. "Give up this foolishness," he said. "We just want to talk to you." "Go fuck yourself," Ricard said. "We mean you no harm, monsieur." "Go back to Germany, you grand cul. Just hand over the valise and I won't trouble you further. Casse-toi. Piss off." The lift operator called out, "2nd floor, ladies' fashion." The door opened and he slid the gate aside. "Excuse me," Ricard said, and worked his way towards the door. As he stepped out, he heard the Gestapo man say, "Excuse me, I'm getting off here." But he couldn't get off. The Parisian men and women in the lift jostled him and pressed around him, all of them staring straight ahead and pretending that nothing was happening. The Gestapo man swore in German. Somebody in the lift called him a dirty Boche. As the door closed, the officer struggled, but the crowd had him penned in. And now the lift departed. Ricard headed for the stairs, ran down to the ground floor and out onto the boulevard. He took a moment to get his bearings, then headed for the métro. Ricard met with Leila at an empty apartment in the elegant La Muette district, the best neighborhood in the high-class 16th arrondissement. The tenants were away, maybe at their country houses, maybe in New York for the duration of the war. Meanwhile, the apartment had been carefully protected. The shutters were closed tight, and every piece of furniture, sofas, chairs, tables, beds, even the dog's little bed, had been covered with sheets. On a sheet-covered sofa, Leila sat with back ramrod straight, head high, thighs, knees and feet pressed together. He found her, as before, intensely desirable, thick black hair combed back on both sides, Mediterranean complexion, gently curved nose, and dark grey eyes. She had her coat over her arm and wore a tweed Chanel suit, hip-length jacket, knee-length skirt, a necklace of lustrous, silvery white pearls, and carried a leather overnight bag. After brief small talk, she explained the site of their meeting by saying, "My friends are generous with their apartment keys."
"You have others you can use?"
"Oh, yes. In my business one must have safe houses."
"That would be the spying business."
"That's what I do, Monsieur Ricard."
"For a long time?"
"Since I was 16.
She smiled at the memory. "How, did you come to get into the business?"
"It runs in families, that's the secret. So one comes to it naturally. We are Turkish. My family is, but we operate wherever the political moment takes us. My uncle worked for the Greeks and spied on the Turks, the Ottoman Turks, just before their empire collapsed in 1918. Of course, he was paid in gold, British gold sovereigns. One doesn't want to work for paper currency. Not ever. Though Swiss francs are sometimes acceptable. My great-aunt learned that the hard way. She spied for the Croats against the Serbs, and had a hellish time of it, her safe deposit box stuffed with Croatian kuna, which she had to convert to gold jewelry. We go back a long way, Monsieur Ricard. Some of the family say the Renaissance, but who knows? I lost 2 ancestors who worked against the Russians in 1903. The Okhrana secret police made them disappear, and ever since we've demanded a high price to operate against Russia."
"And now you work for the British?"
Layla nodded. "This is a big war we have now, and we've had all sorts of offers, but we chose with our hearts, and it wasn't hard to choose. We certainly wanted no part of the Nazis. We don't work for monsters."
Ricard unbuckled the valise and brought out the detonator. "This took some doing. But here it is."
Layla leaned forward on the sheet-covered sofa, and Ricard handed her the device. As she held it in her slim hands, nails polished in carmine red, Ricard was struck by the incongruity. "It seems plain enough," she said, "but I suppose what makes it interesting is whatever goes on under the covering. Let's have a look inside."
Ricard was horrified, and his face showed it.
Now, Ricard, I'm just teasing you." After a moment she looked at him inquisitively and said, "Of course there will be more from your Polish friends."
Ricard shrugged and said, "I don't know, the people who brought it here did it on their own."
"Do you pay them?"
"No."
"Better if you did. Clearer. We respect the impulse for resistance. We depend on it, but you may say of us, 'They have plenty of money. Why not make your life better?'"
"What will you do with it?"
"Make sure it gets to the proper people in London, the people who run these things and have all the strings in their hands. And I promise you they will want more. They'll put it in an amiable way. They are forever polite, but they'll ask."
Layla opened her overnight bag and put the device away. She paused a moment, met Ricard's eyes, then stood up.
"I must be going," she said,
reached into her purse and produced a thick wad of occupation francs.
"Here's something for you. You can pay people whatever they need, or use it yourself."
She handed Ricard a form. His name had been typed across the top line.
"And you have to sign for it. Have you a pen?"
Ricard took out his pen and signed the document. It was then that he realized he was caught, that he would work for Layla as long as the war went on. In one way, an uninviting prospect. He knew that he and Kasia had been lucky. They hadn't been caught, but next time. At least he would remain close to Layla. She was mysterious, remote, unapproachable. And she fascinated him. He had never known a woman remotely like her.
so in the way of the world that made her intensely desirable. Of course he, a mere writer, would never remove that stylish suit and what she wore beneath it. Lacy underwear? White cotton panties? Still, though a mere writer, he had a good imagination with which he undressed her and was delighted and inflamed by what he discovered. Layla returned to her apartment in the Chaussée de la Muette, then walked over to a deluxe gift shop which carried objets, bijoux, fantaisie, costume jewellery, and small statuettes in onyx or crystal, meant for those with money to spend on lovers or friends. The proprietor, whom she'd known and trusted for a long time, led her to a room behind the office. With so many lovely things to buy in Paris, gift wrapping had become a specialty of the city's better shops. Very much the maestro, the proprietor wrapped the detonator in crinkly white paper, set it in a gold gift box with mauve paper, and tied it with a purple ribbon. Layla stepped back to admire the creation. Very fancy, she thought, and very safe. Given the way that Layla dressed and held herself and the impressive presentation of the package, she knew that the customs officers at Orly Airfield would not ask that it be unwrapped. This was not the first time she had disguised contraband objects, and she knew it would work. At Orly Airfield, Layla found her pilot friend and gave him an envelope. He was always pleased to see her. An hour later she boarded a Potés 56, a low-wing monoplane built of plywood, which flew the mail from Paris to Madrid, a 7-hour trip with a refueling stop at Rivesaltes Airfield in Perpignan. The wind was blowing hard that morning, with streaks of grey cloud moving overhead, and the plane shuddered and plunged as the pilot, seated directly in front of Layla, fought with the controls and talked to himself in a language she didn't recognize. There was one other seat on the Potés. The rest of the plane was packed with canvas mailbags, and it was occupied just before takeoff by a military officer of some nation who didn't fly well, and for the entire trip hugged a briefcase to his chest with both arms, all the while praying or cursing under his breath. In Madrid, Layla called an accommodation number, a Thomas Cook travel agency, and told them she would be at the Hôtel Miramar, old, run-down, 12 rooms. There Layla took a room and waited for a telephone call. 20 minutes later the phone croaked, and on the other end an Englishman speaking Spanish told her to go to the Restaurant Sobrino de Botín. She took a taxi there and waited at the reception desk. She didn't wait long. 2 civil servants from the British Embassy, the second secretary and the political officer, joined her, and they sat down to eat lunch. The Sobrino de Botín was said to be the world's oldest restaurant, opened in 1725. The long, narrow room, built of stone, was barrel-vaulted, the ceiling arching overhead. When their sherries arrived, Layla presented her gift-wrapped package, and the civil servants, who did espionage duty at the embassy, took turns in the WC, inspecting the gift, and returned to the table with grateful smiles. They ordered the speciality, sopa de ajo, an egg poached in chicken broth flavoured with garlic and sherry, and asked Layla in their smooth tenor voices when she would have more presents for them. Not if. When. It was 1942, Britain was not winning the war, but it was no longer losing, and the time had come to go on the offensive. They had, first of all, to win the war of blockades. In October of 1942, 56 merchant ships had been put out of commission, which meant that food, war materiel, and, crucially, oil, did not reach the United Kingdom. Thus, RAF bombers hit the naval yards in Kiel for 3 nights, destroying the U-boat pens, the cranes and the workshops, and flattening the Schönbrunn Grundschule High School where the Polish labourers were housed. The Poles themselves were lucky, at work in an underground factory when the bombs fell. For the German engineers, there was no point in trying to rebuild, so they shifted the U-boat manufacture west, to France, to existing naval yards at the port of Saint-Nazaire, closer to the RAF bombers, but heavily protected by anti-aircraft emplacements and Luftwaffe fighter planes. Meanwhile, Paul Ricard was at work in his garret, adding slow pages to The Investigator, hoping that Julien Montresor, his publisher, was busy with other projects. Each time the telephone rang, he hesitated to answer it, afraid that Montresor was going to hound him. But the publisher did not call. Who did call was Layla. She wanted to meet with him, and had chosen for the meeting a room at the Grand Hôtel in the Opéra district. Waiting for him in the lobby, she led him upstairs to a handsomely furnished room on the top floor. It was 5:30 in the afternoon. The lights in the room were low. Layla was wearing a black silk dress, tied at the waist with the same material. A soft, supple, revealing dress. "Shall we have drinks sent up?" she said. "A brandy? A glass of wine?" "No, not tonight. Let's have whiskey sodas." The telephone was on a bedside table, and he watched, avidly, the shifting black silk as she walked over to call room service. After calling, she stood at the window for a moment, then said, "Strange. A dark city. I'll never get used to it." He joined her at the window, their shoulders almost touching, then, magically, touching. On the street below them, Parisians were going home from work, bundled up against the icy wind, walking quickly with heads down to spare their faces from the cold. "The world goes on," she said, taking his hand. "Sometimes I would like to live a different life, an everyday life." "You would be bored soon enough," Ricard said. "You require excitement, I think." "Yes, I suppose you're right, still." When there was a tap at the door, she said, "Our drinks." Ricard went to get them. In the hall, a bellboy, wearing a rakishly tilted cap, held a silver tray with the drinks, the soda water bubbling in tall glasses. Ricard tipped him, then set the tray on a low table in front of a sofa. Layla sat down and patted the cushion next to her. "Don't be a stranger," she said, smiling at him. "Salut," Ricard said. They clinked glasses and sipped at the whiskey soda. "Well, I felt that," she said. Ricard said, "Me too." "We can do better," she said. Opening her purse, she took out a small glass jar that had once held caviar, and a tiny silver spoon. In the jar, white powder. She filled the spoon and held it up to his nose. He sniffed it up. She then helped herself. "Again?" she said. "Why not?" "You like cocaine?" He nodded, face numb, then drank some whiskey soda. She lit a cigarette and, eyes closed, exhaled plumes of smoke from her nose and rested her head on the sofa. Then she looked at him and said, "Feeling good?" "Better than good." He was silent for a time, glad, more than glad, for her gracious presence. She came from a different world, richer than his, a world of aristocrats. But now, in this hotel room in Paris, they were about to make love. To be no more than two lovers with the long night to themselves. "Why don't you take off your dress?" he said. She laughed and stood up. "Glad you said that. I was going to spill my drink on it, accidentally on purpose." She untied the belt, then took the dress by the hem, wriggled out of it and tossed it over the back of a chair. She was wearing snug white cotton panties, cut low on top and high on the bottom.
End of Disc 3.